I kept my study locked for 10 years. When my son's wife copied my key, I already knew it. My son called in a panic, screaming that she went through the study and found the safe. I had been ready for this from the very beginning. My name is Wendell, I am 70 years old, and I spent my entire career hunting liars. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to set a trap for the family members who thought you were a fool. The floorboards in the upstairs hallway groaned under the weight of someone trying to walk silently. I stood completely still in the dark shadow of the staircase, my eyes fixed on the pale yellow light spilling from the crack of my bedroom door. Vanessa, my son, Jordan's wife, stood near my solid oak dresser. Her slender frame cast a sharp shadow against the wall. In her hand, she held my heavy brass study key. I watched her press the jagged metal firmly into a thick block of soft molding clay. Her breathing was steady, betraying no guilt. She pulled the key out, inspected the perfect impression under the lamplight, and slipped the clay into her designer purse. She carefully wiped the brass key with her sleeve to remove any residue. She returned the key to my nightstand exactly where I had left it. She adjusted the angle of the key so it matched my precise habits. I did not shout. I did not burst into the room to demand answers or threaten to call the police. Anger is a useless emotion when you are dealing with a thief in your own home. It clouds judgment. It gives the enemy an advantage. I simply turned around and walked down the stairs. Every step was calculated. The cold night air hit my face as I exited through the back door. My boots crunched against the gravel driveway. I unlocked my car, started the engine, and backed out without turning on the headlights until I reached the main road. I drove through the silent streets with absolute clarity. Vanessa thought she was clever. She thought she was outsmarting an old man whose mind was fading into oblivion. She believed that locked study contained the answers to all her financial problems. She had no idea she was playing a game I had designed specifically for her. Every move she made was anticipated. The clay impression was not a breach of my security. It was the activation of my strategy. She had just handed me the weapon I needed to destroy her. The neon sign of an all-night diner illuminated the brick building where my attorney Rebecca Thorne kept her office. She was waiting for me in the dimly lit lobby. Rebecca knew my habits. We had worked together for nearly 2 decades before my retirement. I was a forensic accountant. I was the man corporations called when millions of dollars vanished into thin air. I spent my life tracking hidden assets, unmasking shell companies, and destroying the careers of executives who thought they were untouchable. I knew how greedy minds operated. I knew how they justified their thefts. I handed Rebecca a thick manila folder. She did not open it. She just looked at me with a steady, calculating gaze. She knew the gravity of my visit. I told her to activate Project Trojan Bird. Rebecca nodded, locked the folder in her briefcase, and told me it would be done by morning. She did not ask for explanations. The legal mechanisms were already in place. Jordan and his white wife, Vanessa, had spent the last 5 years staring at the heavy oak door of my study. They whispered about it during Thanksgiving dinners. They made passive-aggressive jokes about my secrecy whenever they needed cash. They were utterly convinced I hoarded stacks of untraceable cash inside that room. They assumed an outdated will sat in a desk drawer waiting to be altered to their benefit. They viewed my home as their personal waiting room for an inheritance they felt they deserved immediately. Jordan lacked the spine to demand the key directly. Vanessa lacked the patience to wait for my death. Her corporate salary never matched her extravagant lifestyle, and my son was too weak to deny her demands. I got back into my car. The engine hummed softly in the empty parking lot. I had spent 6 months preparing that study for the exact moment Vanessa decided to cross the line. The lock on the door was just a psychological barrier. I wanted her to break in. I needed her to commit a felony so severe that neither she nor my cowardly son could ever crawl back from the consequences. I watched the streetlights reflect on my windshield. The trap was perfectly set. I just needed to wait for her to take the bait. My phone illuminated the dark interior of the car. The caller ID flashed Jordan's name. I let it ring 3 times before pressing the answer button. I did not say hello. I just listened to the chaotic background noise. Jordan was hyperventilating. His voice cracked as he screamed into the receiver. He shouted that Vanessa had gone into my study while I was out. She had brought a locksmith tool and cracked the vintage combination safe hidden behind my bookshelf. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, but my voice remained perfectly flat. I asked him what she took. Jordan sobbed, his panic echoing through the car speakers. He said she found a power of attorney document with my signature on it. She was currently on the other line with the bank using the document to access my accounts. Jordan begged me to come home. He swore he had nothing to do with it. He claimed he tried to stop her, but she locked herself in the master bedroom with her laptop. He warned me that she was transferring funds right at this very moment. I listened to his pathetic excuses and felt nothing but a cold, hard resolve. I did not yell at my son. I did not tell him to call the police. I calmly told him I would be there soon and hung up the phone. I shifted the car into drive. Vanessa thought she had found the golden ticket. She thought that piece of paper gave her the absolute right to strip my life bare and leave me with nothing. She did not realize the safe was a trap. The document she held was authentic, but the accounts it connected to were rigged. She was walking blindly into a financial minefield. Every digital signature she applied to those bank transfers was currently logging her IP address and associating her name with highly monitored federal watch lists. I pressed my foot against the gas pedal. The trap had just snapped shut. The game of patience was over. Now the consequences would begin to flow. I accelerated down the highway, heading back to the house where my son was crying and his wife was sealing her own doom. The conflict was no longer a silent tension in the hallways. It was a blazing fire, and I was holding the only extinguisher. I stepped through the heavy mahogany front door, the brass hinges clicking shut with a definitive thud that echoed through the foyer. The living room lights blazed at full intensity, casting harsh shadows across the walls. Vanessa stood precisely in the center of the Persian rug, her posture rigid with unearned authority. She held a thick ivory-colored document in her right hand, waving it like a victorious battle flag. Her pale face flushed with the thrill of her own perceived brilliance. She did not waste time with pleasantries or false pretenses. She announced fiercely that the game was over. She claimed she had spent the last 3 months meticulously documenting my supposed mental decline. According to her fabricated narrative, I was leaving the stove on, forgetting the names of my own relatives, and wandering the neighborhood streets at night. She told me the document in her hand was a fully executed power of attorney, complete with my own signature, which she had supposedly found unprotected in my unlocked study. She declared that it granted her absolute, irrevocable control over my entire estate, my financial portfolios, and my medical decisions. She spoke fast, her voice dripping with venom and a deeply artificial concern. She claimed she was stepping in to protect the family legacy from a senile old man who was no longer fit to manage his own checking account. She expected me to rage. She expected me to lunge at her, to deny her accusations, to threaten her with the police. Criminals always anticipate chaos because chaos gives them a platform to play the victim. I gave her absolutely nothing. I stood perfectly still, letting her shrill voice bounce off the hardwood floors. I observed the frantic energy in her eyes, the desperate need for absolute dominance over a man who had built a life she could only dream of stealing. The document she held was indeed a power of attorney. I had drafted it myself. I had forged my own signature with a deliberate microscopic flaw, and I had left it inside the safe specifically for her to find. She was holding a loaded gun to her own head, completely convinced she had me cornered. I slowly unbuttoned my wool coat and walked past her, my silence unnerving her far more than any screaming match ever could. My eyes shifted away from Vanessa to the dark shadows near the dining room entrance. Jordan stood there, his shoulders hunched, his gaze glued to the floorboards. My only son, a grown man of 40, shrinking into the background while his wife orchestrated the theft of his father's entire life. Seeing him cower triggered a visceral reaction in my chest, bringing forth a cold wave of memory that I had tried to bury for exactly 5 years. His cowardly silence was not new. It was the exact same silence he maintained the year my wife Evelyn died. Evelyn had been the unshakable backbone of our family, a woman of immense grace and relentless work ethic who commanded respect in our community. She took on double shifts at the hospital administration office when her body demanded rest. She intercepted the aggressive collection notices, hid the threatening voicemails from underground bookies, and quietly drained her own personal retirement accounts. She did it all to silently cover the $50,000 Jordan owed to a ruthless sports betting ring operating out of the South Side. Jordan never confessed his sins to me. He just let his mother work herself into a stress-induced cardiac arrest. He stood in the corner of her hospital room while the monitors flatlined, maintaining that identical pathetic posture, letting her take the ultimate fall for his weakness. Now history was repeating itself with terrifying precision. He was standing by letting Vanessa drain my life, just as he had drained Evelyn's. I felt a profound, chilling detachment from the boy I had raised. The biological tie severed completely in that precise moment. I walked over to my vintage leather armchair and sat down slowly, resting my hands firmly on the worn armrests. I looked directly at Vanessa, stripping every ounce of emotion from my face. I told her the document looked incredibly official. I invited her to take it straight to the bank. I told her she should exercise her new legal authority immediately and secure whatever funds she felt she deserved. I told her not to waste another single minute standing in my living room. Vanessa blinked rapidly, entirely derailed by my complete lack of resistance. She aggressively searched my face for sarcasm for a hidden trap, but I offered her a mask of pure, absolute defeat. A triumphant, arrogant smirk slowly spread across her face. She shoved the document into her designer leather tote bag, grabbed her car keys from the table, and snapped her fingers at Jordan. He followed her out the front door without daring to look back at me. The heavy deadbolt clicked shut. The house fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. I did not move from my chair. I simply waited in the quiet room. I listened to the rhythmic, methodical ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I tracked the minutes as they slowly turned into hours. The morning sun began to rise, casting long, sharp shadows across the living room floor. Exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes later, the landline on the side table rang sharply. I picked up the receiver. It was Calvin, the senior branch manager at the downtown financial district. Calvin's voice trembled with a severe mixture of professional panic and deep apology. He told me he had tried to reach me earlier, but his calls had been intercepted and redirected by an automated block placed on my account. He informed me that Vanessa had just marched into the main branch waving the power of attorney. She had ruthlessly bypassed the standard waiting periods by citing a fabricated critical medical emergency regarding my immediate health. Calvin swallowed hard over the line, his breath shaky. He delivered the final devastating blow. Vanessa had executed a massive equity line of credit, leveraging the entire appraised value of my home. She had borrowed $500,000 directly against the property. The funds had already been wired into an offshore holding account she established under a newly formed corporate shell company. Calvin apologized profusely, stating his hands were legally tied by the document she presented and the aggressive threats of a lawsuit she made in the lobby. The call ended abruptly. The dial tone hummed loudly in my ear. The trap was perfectly set, the bait was completely swallowed, but the immediate reality was catastrophic. Vanessa had successfully chained a $500,000 debt entirely to my name, leaving me legally responsible for a massive fortune she had already stolen. The red notification icon flared on my encrypted tablet screen precisely at 8 in the morning. The $500,000 lien had officially registered against my property deed. Vanessa moved with the speed of a desperate predator trying to secure her prize before the trap could spring. I picked up my secure mobile line and dialed Rebecca. She answered on the first ring with the sharp efficiency I had relied on for 2 decades. I instructed her to execute the complete lockdown on the primary trust. She confirmed the firewall was active and the authentic assets were buried behind impenetrable corporate structures that no forged document could ever pierce. The decoy account had absorbed the initial blow perfectly, just as we had planned. I hung up the phone just as the front door rattled open with a violent shove. Vanessa marched into the foyer, her high heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood. She did not come alone. A tall man with a receding hairline and a poorly fitted gray suit followed close behind her. He clutched a leather-bound clipboard against his chest like a shield. Vanessa pointed a manicured finger directly at me. She announced that this was Dr. Aris and he was here to conduct an emergency psychiatric evaluation. She claimed my recent behavior left her no choice but to seek immediate medical intervention to determine my mental competency. She spoke with a rehearsed authority intended to intimidate a fragile elder into submission. The man stepped forward and introduced himself as an independent specialist hired by my concerned family. He pulled a pen from his pocket and stood over my armchair, trying to cast an imposing shadow. He carried no medical bag. He possessed no air of professional empathy. He looked exactly like a man hired to do a dirty job for a quick cash payout. I remained seated in my leather chair. I folded my hands over my lap and stared at the cheap, wrinkled fabric of his suit. I did not offer him a greeting. I did not demand to see his medical credentials. I knew arguing would only give them the audio recording they desperately wanted. They needed me to shout. They needed me to act erratic and confused. I offered them absolute silence. The man cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with my total lack of reaction. Vanessa urged him forward, her voice tight with artificial urgency. She commanded him to begin the assessment immediately. The man cleared his throat again and immediately launched into a barrage of aggressive cognitive tests. He demanded I tell him the current year and the day of the week. He asked me to name the sitting president. He commanded me to count backward from 100 by sevens. His voice grew louder and more condescending with every unanswered question. He waved his pen in my face and warned me that refusing to cooperate would be formally documented as severe cognitive unresponsiveness. Vanessa stood near the fireplace with her arms crossed tightly across her chest. A smug, triumphant smile danced on her lips. She was entirely convinced she was witnessing the final collapse of my independence. She thought my silence was the product of fear and senility. I let the fake doctor ramble for another 60 seconds. I observed the heavy sweat forming on his brow as he struggled to maintain his clinical facade under my unwavering gaze. Then I slowly reached for the television remote resting on the side table. I pressed the power button. The large flat screen mounted above the fireplace flared to life. I did not turn on the morning news. I accessed the secure server linked to the concealed high-definition cameras mounted along my roofline. I selected a specific video file time-stamped exactly 12 minutes prior. The screen displayed crisp, vibrant footage of my own driveway. The video showed Vanessa standing next to her luxury sedan. The fake doctor stood right beside her, leaning against the car door. The footage captured Vanessa reaching into her designer bag and pulling out a thick, white envelope. She handed the envelope directly to the man in the gray suit. He opened the flap and thumbed through a thick stack of $100 bills before sliding it into his jacket pocket with a satisfied nod. I paused the video right on a clear, high-resolution close-up of his greedy smile. I placed the remote back onto the side table and looked up at the man. I calmly asked him if counting his bribe money qualified as a cognitive exercise. I watched the blood instantly drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. The heavy clipboard slipped from his sweaty fingers and clattered loudly onto the hardwood floor. His entire posture crumbled under the weight of undeniable digitized truth. The man did not attempt to defend himself. He did not ask for his clipboard back. He turned on his heel and bolted toward the front door like a terrified animal. He sprinted down the concrete walkway and practically threw himself into his rusted sedan before speeding away from the curb, leaving dark tire marks on the asphalt. The entire medical intervention collapsed in less than 3 minutes. Vanessa stood frozen by the fireplace. Her smug expression vanished entirely, replaced by a contorted mask of pure disbelief. The sudden destruction of her carefully planned ambush sent her into a blind, unhinged rage. She grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the mantel. She swung it with all her might directly into the center of the television screen. The glass shattered outward in a violent spray of sparks and sharp fragments raining down onto the Persian rug. The screen went black immediately. She screamed a string of venomous curses at me, her voice breaking with fury, and stormed out of the house. She slammed the door hard enough to rattle the window panes in their frames. I did not flinch. I retrieved a broom from the kitchen, swept the broken glass off the rug, and went to sleep with perfect peace of mind. The next morning, I drove to the local grocery store. I filled a small basket with fresh produce, bread, and black coffee. I placed my items on the conveyor belt and handed the cashier my standard debit card. She swiped the card through the terminal. The machine beeped a sharp metallic warning. The screen flashed bright red with a declined message. The cashier offered a polite apology and tried the transaction again, assuming a simple chip error. The result was the exact same. I took the card back and stepped out of the line. I opened the banking application on my phone while standing in the fluorescent lit aisle. The checking account showed a negative balance. A bright red notification banner warned me that the account had been frozen due to a primary account holder directive. Vanessa had not stopped at the $500,000 loan. She had used the forged power of attorney to systematically lock down every single daily spending account linked to my name. She was actively cutting off my access to food, fuel, and basic survival necessities. The financial siege had officially begun. The cashier, a young woman with tired eyes, stared at the flashing red error message on her terminal screen. She offered a quiet, sympathetic apology, likely assuming my fixed retirement income had simply run dry before the end of the month. I did not offer any explanation, nor did I display a single ounce of embarrassment. I simply reached into the inner breast pocket of my wool coat and pulled out a sleek silver money clip. I extracted a crisp, newly minted $100 bill and placed it flat on the black conveyor belt. Her eyes widened slightly as she took the cash, processed the transaction, and handed me my change along with the heavy paper bags. I thanked her politely, picked up my groceries, and walked out of the sliding glass doors. The biting morning chill hit my face instantly, but my mind was burning with absolute crystalline clarity. I understood exactly what Vanessa was attempting to execute. The frozen checking account was not just a greedy cash grab. It was a highly calculated siege tactic. She intended to enact a total financial strangulation. By aggressively cutting off my access to daily funds, she believed she could starve me out of my own home. She wanted to humiliate me, force me to beg for gas money, and make me physically dependent on her fabricated goodwill. She calculated that a 70-year-old African-American man without a functioning debit card would surrender his independence within 48 hours. She expected me to crawl back to the living room, sign whatever additional documents she demanded, and plead for a meager grocery stipend. It was a classic corporate takeover strategy applied directly to domestic abuse. You choke the supply lines until the target submits to your authority. I loaded the brown paper bags into the trunk of my sedan and slammed it shut. The heavy metallic thud echoed across the empty parking lot. Vanessa was banking entirely on my perceived fragility. She assumed my age equated to vulnerability and ignorance. She had drastically miscalculated the resilience and preparation of a man who had spent his entire professional life dissecting the minds of ruthless financial predators. I got into the driver's seat, but I did not turn the steering wheel back toward my neighborhood. Calling the house to scream at her would only validate her delusion of power. It would give her the chaotic reaction she desperately craved to justify her fake psychiatric narrative. I drove my vehicle straight past our residential district and headed directly toward the main downtown postal hub. My leather briefcase sat on the passenger seat holding a thick, unmarked parcel I had prepared 3 weeks ago. I walked into the busy post office, bypassed the automated kiosks, and approached the counter. I purchased priority overnight postage, paid the clerk entirely in cash, and dropped the heavy package into the outgoing bin. The parcel was addressed directly to the Vice President of Human Resources at the commercial real estate firm where Vanessa served as a financial director. Inside that sealed envelope sat a meticulously compiled 90-page anonymous dossier. It contained irrefutable forensic evidence of Vanessa redirecting corporate pension funds into offshore shell accounts she controlled. I did not need to confront her in my kitchen when I could quietly detonate her entire professional existence from a sterile post office lobby. Vanessa genuinely believed she held the winning hand because she successfully froze my checking account. What my arrogant daughter-in-law completely failed to understand is the golden rule of forensic accounting. You never keep the actual treasury connected to the front door. The account she proudly locked down using her forged power of attorney was nothing more than a carefully constructed decoy. It held exactly $1,940. It was a sacrificial lamb designed specifically to trigger my security alerts without exposing the primary trust. The true bulk of my wealth was buried deep beneath layers of encrypted corporate holding companies and anonymous trusts managed by Rebecca Thorne. Vanessa thought she had successfully drained my ocean, but she had merely scooped up a shallow puddle in the driveway. I smiled as I walked back to my car. The postal receipt sat safely in my coat pocket. Her corporate execution was officially in motion. I unlocked the front door of my house and carried the groceries directly into the kitchen. I began organizing the fresh produce into the refrigerator with deliberate, measured movements, enjoying the profound quiet of the empty house. That peace was instantly shattered. The heavy front door burst open, slamming violently against the hallway wall with enough force to crack the plaster. Rapid, heavy footsteps pounded across the hardwood floor. Jordan stormed into the kitchen. He was panting heavily, his chest heaving under a wrinkled, sweat-stained dress shirt. His eyes were wide with a frantic, unhinged panic that I had not seen since the horrific day his mother died. He marched straight up to the kitchen island and slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the granite countertop. The aggressive impact scattered my grocery receipts across the floor. He pointed a trembling, desperate finger at the papers and demanded I sign the property deed completely over to him right this second. His voice was shrill, cracking under an immense invisible pressure. He confessed that Vanessa's $500,000 loan had triggered a massive ripple effect he could not control. Vanessa thought she was securing her own wealth, but her sudden influx of liquid cash had alerted the underground syndicate Jordan owed his life to. The loan sharks monitoring his activity saw the massive loan register against my property. They did not care about Vanessa's white-collar corporate schemes or her power trips. They only cared about their unpaid street debts. Jordan leaned across the island, his face dripping with cold sweat, and informed me that his creditors were no longer accepting partial payments or hollow excuses. They wanted the entire $500,000 immediately. He shoved a blue pen toward my chest and screamed that if I did not sign the house away to cover the debt by Friday night, The syndicate enforcers would track him down and shatter both of his legs with baseball bats. The artificial war Vanessa started had just collided violently with the very real, very deadly criminal underworld my son had dragged into our lives. Jordan stood panting over the kitchen island, his chest heaving as the terrifying reality of his criminal debt filled the room. The stack of loan guarantee papers sat between us, crisp and stark against the dark granite countertop. He demanded my signature. He pleaded that my house was the only collateral the underground syndicate would accept to spare his legs from being shattered by the weekend. I looked at the legal documents, then looked at the desperate, sweating man who had long ago ceased to be the son I raised. I reached out and picked up the thick stack of papers. The document felt heavy, loaded with the crushing weight of his perpetual failures and endless selfish demands. Jordan let out a sharp, ragged breath of relief, entirely convinced I was about to capitulate to his terror just as his mother always had. He pulled a silver pen from his breast pocket and held it out to me, his hand trembling so violently the ink cartridge rattled loudly inside the metal casing. I did not take the pen. I turned my back to him and walked slowly out of the kitchen, carrying the documents into the adjacent living room. The large stone fireplace roared with a steady, intense heat, casting long, dancing shadows across the repaired hardwood floor. Jordan followed me closely, his voice rising in shrill confusion as he asked where I was going. I did not answer him. I stepped directly up to the iron grate. Without a single second of hesitation, I tossed the entire stack of loan guarantee papers directly into the center of the blazing fire. The thick white pages curled instantly, turning brown at the edges before erupting into a violent burst of bright orange flames. The binding melted, and the legal text turned to gray ash in a matter of seconds, floating upward into the dark, soot-stained chimney. The swift, irreversible action completely eradicated his final, desperate exit strategy. The fire consumed his lifeline. The intense heat warmed my face, but my chest felt completely hollow, devoid of the panic he wanted me to feel. I watched the last corner of the signature page disintegrate into absolute nothingness. Jordan dropped to his knees on the Persian rug. A loud primal sob ripped from his throat as he watched his only salvation burn to ash. He clutched his hair, rocking back and forth, weeping uncontrollably, while begging me to understand that the loan sharks would genuinely kill him. I remained standing over him, completely unmoved by the theatrical display of his terror. I looked down at the weeping man and began to recite a precise, unyielding list of dates and figures completely from memory. I spoke in a voice entirely devoid of warmth. I reminded him of October 14th, exactly 8 years ago, when I sold my fully restored vintage Mustang for $40,000 under market value just to cover his embezzled corporate funds before his employer could press formal criminal charges. I detailed the morning of April 2nd, 5 years prior, when I completely drained my early retirement growth fund, absorbing a massive federal tax penalty to pay off the illegal sports bookies who had explicitly threatened to burn down his apartment building. I recited the exact dollar amount his mother Evelyn had secretly redirected from our own specialized healthcare budget to settle his hidden credit card debts, a fatal choice that directly accelerated her massive cardiac arrest. I listed these sacrifices chronologically, ensuring the sheer volume of his financial parasitism echoed loudly in the quiet room. Jordan tried to interrupt, stammering panicked apologies and swearing to God that this time was absolutely different. I silenced his whining with a single sharp gesture of my right hand. I declared an absolute definitive end to the bailouts. I told him that a life-threatening emergency created by his own extreme greed does not constitute a moral or financial obligation on my part. I informed him that the men coming to break his legs were a direct consequence of his own arrogance, and he would have to face them with the exact same courage he used to steal from his mother. My words struck him with physical force. He realized that the eternal safety net he had aggressively exploited his entire adult life was permanently severed. I was no longer his protector. I was merely the audience to his totally self-inflicted destruction. The heavy wooden front door crashed open, slamming against the plaster wall with a violent, echoing thud. Vanessa burst into the foyer, moving with a frantic, uncoordinated energy that completely shattered her usual polished corporate composure. Her meticulously styled hair was disheveled, and her expensive designer jacket hung half unbuttoned off her shoulder. She clutched her mobile phone tightly in both hands, staring at the glowing screen with wide, terrified eyes. She completely ignored her sobbing husband on the floor and rushed directly toward my armchair. Her voice pitched into a hysterical, breathless shriek as she demanded to know exactly what I had done to the banking system. She announced that the financial institution had just completely frozen the $500,000 equity loan she had successfully extracted against my property. The offshore transfer had been halted mid-transaction, securely locking the massive sum of stolen money in an impenetrable digital purgatory. I sat back down in my leather armchair and crossed my legs, watching her panic spiral out of control. I calmly explained the specific ruthless mechanics of the trap she had so eagerly walked into. The forged power of attorney document she had stolen from my decoy safe was not just a useless prop. I had spent weeks utilizing my former forensic accounting contacts to embed a specialized dormant Federal Bureau of Investigation, tracking serial number directly into the digital watermark of that specific legal paper. I explained that the exact moment the bank manager scanned the document to authorize the massive equity loan, the hidden serial number automatically triggered a severe wire fraud alert across multiple federal monitoring systems. Vanessa's breath hitched painfully in her throat as the inescapable magnitude of her fatal error settled heavily over the room. I informed her that the bank had not merely stopped the transaction due to a clerical error. The automated federal system had immediately flagged her legal identity, her corporate routing address, and her offshore shell company for extreme financial crimes. She had permanently documented her own grand larceny directly on federal servers. Her phone began to vibrate incessantly in her trembling hands, flashing a long string of urgent, panicked notifications from her personal defense attorney. The FBI was no longer a theoretical threat. They were actively hunting her for felony wire fraud, and the digital evidence she created was completely irrefutable. 3 sharp, synchronized knocks echo through the foyer, instantly silencing Vanessa's frantic pacing. The heavy oak door shudders under the weight of the undeniable authority waiting on the other side. I do not rush to answer it. I stand up slowly, smoothing the creases of my trousers, and walk past my paralyzed daughter-in-law to turn the brass handle. 2 men in immaculate dark suits step into the entryway holding up golden badges encased in black leather. They identify themselves as special agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation specifically assigned to the Financial Crimes Division. They state Vanessa's full legal name, their voices completely devoid of emotion, and inform her that she is the primary suspect in an active wire fraud investigation involving offshore shell corporations. The remaining color instantly drains from Vanessa's face, leaving her skin a sickening chalky gray. Her confident corporate facade shatters into a million jagged pieces. Panic consumes her entirely. Instead of maintaining the cold, calculated persona she uses to dominate boardrooms and humiliate her husband, she reverts to the frantic desperation of a cornered animal. She violently thrusts her trembling finger directly at my chest and begins screaming uncontrollably. She shouts that I orchestrated the entire transfer. She shrieks that I am a manipulative, senile old man who tricked her into signing the financial documents under the guise of helping him manage his estate. She weaves a frantic, incoherent web of lies right there on my hardwood floor, claiming I forced her to execute the $500,000 equity loan because my mind was failing and I was terrified of losing the property. Jordan cowers by the fireplace, physically shrinking away from the men in suits, entirely unwilling to defend the wife who rules his life. The federal agents do not react to her hysterical performance. They do not look at me with suspicion. They simply stare at her with the clinical detachment of men who have watched 1,000 guilty executives tell the exact same desperate lie. Her voice echoes sharply off the vaulted ceiling, cracking as she hyperventilates, determined to build a narrative where she is the innocent victim of my supposed elder abuse. I remain perfectly silent, letting her dig her grave deeper with every frantic, accusatory word she spits into the heavy, stagnant air of the hallway. The lead agent steps forward, smoothly cutting through her chaotic rambling. He produces a folded warrant from his interior jacket pocket and demands the immediate surrender of all her electronic devices, specifying her mobile phone and the encrypted corporate laptop currently resting on my dining table. Vanessa physically recoils, clutching her phone to her chest as if it were a vital organ. Her survival instinct finally overrides her panic. She firmly clamps her mouth shut, lifts her chin with a defiant snap, and invokes her legal right to remain silent, demanding the immediate presence of her defense attorney. She believes her silence will halt the momentum of the federal machine. She assumes that without a direct confession, the agents have nothing but circumstantial banking anomalies that her high-priced lawyers can easily untangle in a courtroom. She forgets that she is standing in a house I built, operating within a perimeter I secured. I take 2 deliberate steps forward and calmly address the agents. I pull a small black thumb drive from my pocket and hold it out. I inform them that they will not need to rely solely on digital financial trails or coerced confessions to build their case. I explain that the drive contains ultra-high-definition video and audio recordings captured by concealed security lenses integrated directly into the walls of my study and the upstairs hallway. I spent a significant portion of my career investigating corporate espionage, a background that taught me the absolute necessity of indisputable visual evidence. The footage on the drive details Vanessa meticulously pressing my brass study key into a block of molding clay. It captures her returning days later with a freshly cut duplicate, bypassing the lock and systematically breaking into the vintage safe. It records her victorious laughter as she steals the power of attorney document she is now claiming I forced her to sign. The federal agents accept the drive with a respectful nod, bagging it as pristine, uncontaminated evidence. Vanessa stares at the tiny black device resting inside the clear plastic evidence bag, fully realizing the catastrophic magnitude of her own arrogance. She had walked through my home with absolute impunity, believing I was a blind, helpless old fool. Her unshakable superiority complex had completely blinded her to the trap, transforming her own brazen actions into the undeniable, irrefutable proof of her absolute guilt. The agents secure Vanessa's laptop and phone, formally advising her not to leave the city before exiting the house. The heavy mahogany door clicks shut behind them, leaving a toxic, suffocating tension vibrating in the air. The moment the federal vehicle pulls away from the curb, Vanessa unleashes a primal, feral rage. She does not direct her fury at me. She knows I am an impenetrable fortress. Instead, she aggressively pivots and marches directly toward Jordan, who is still trembling pathetically near the cold fireplace. She grabs him by the collar of his sweat-stained shirt, her fingernails digging violently into the fabric. She backs him hard against the stone mantel, her face inches from his, practically spitting her words. She coldly informs him that she is facing federal prison time, the total destruction of her lucrative career, and complete financial ruin. She refuses to sink alone. She delivers a ruthless, razor-sharp ultimatum with eyes utterly devoid of humanity. She tells Jordan that he must physically throw me out of this house tonight. He must force me onto the street, change the security codes, and seize physical control of the property so they can use it as leverage to negotiate their legal survival. If he fails to remove me, she promises to immediately contact the federal prosecutors and flip the entire narrative. She swears she will testify under oath that Jordan orchestrated the entire financial scheme to pay off his dangerous underground loan sharks. She promises to hand the federal agents every piece of digital correspondence proving his immense gambling debts, framing him as the mastermind who forced his innocent wife to steal the documents to save his life. Jordan gasps, his face draining of all color as the crushing weight of his wife's sociopathic survival instinct settles directly onto his shoulders. He is trapped between the imminent threat of ruthless street enforcers shattering his legs and a federal prison sentence engineered by the woman he married. Vanessa releases his collar, taking a step back to admire the sheer terror paralyzing her husband. She gives him exactly 1 hour to make his choice. The battle lines are completely redrawn, pushing a cowardly son to make the ultimate unforgivable decision against his own father to preserve his pathetic, fragile existence. Jordan did not hesitate. He did not ask for forgiveness or try to negotiate a peaceful resolution. The immediate threat of a federal wire fraud indictment orchestrated by his own wife, combined with the looming highly physical violence of underground loan shark enforcers, completely eroded whatever fragile morality he had left. He chose self-preservation over the man who had given him life. He marched directly up the hardwood stairs, his boots stomping heavily, and kicked open the door to my master bedroom. I remained standing in the hallway, watching the boy I raised devolve into a cornered, panicked animal, desperate to appease a master who hated him. He yanked a roll of heavy, industrial black plastic trash bags from his coat pocket. He tore one free with a sharp, violent snap that echoed loudly in the quiet room. He threw open my closet doors, ignoring the careful organization, and began ripping my tailored suits from their wooden hangers. He shoved wool sweaters, crisp dress shirts, and leather belts into the cheap plastic, treating my life's possessions like contaminated waste that needed to be purged immediately. His breathing was heavy, fast, and ragged. He actively avoided looking at my face, fixing his terrified gaze entirely on the task of my immediate physical erasure. I did not utter a single word of protest. I watched him tie the plastic bags shut with frantic, uncoordinated knots. He grabbed 2 heavy bags in each hand and dragged them roughly down the stairs. The thick plastic scraped aggressively against the varnished wood, leaving faint scuff marks behind. I followed him at a steady, measured pace. He reached the foyer, unlocked the heavy front door, and threw it wide open. A torrential, freezing downpour was already lashing against the concrete porch. The brutal wind drove the rain directly into the entryway, soaking the Persian rug. Jordan hurled the bags outside into the severe weather. They landed with a dull, wet thud against the flooded wooden planks. He turned to face me for a fraction of a second. His eyes were completely hollow, stripped of everything except pure selfish survival instinct. He ordered me to get out of the house. He did not scream the words. He delivered the command with a pathetic, trembling whisper. I stepped firmly across the threshold, my leather shoes hitting the wet porch. Jordan instantly slammed the heavy oak door shut behind me. The brass deadbolt engaged with a heavy metallic crack. A second later, the digital security keypad mounted on the doorframe beeped rapidly in the darkness. He was actively changing the access codes, formally cementing my physical exile into the digital security system. I stood on the porch while the freezing rain immediately soaked through the thick shoulders of my wool coat. I did not bang my fists against the heavy wood or demand to be let back inside. I did not shout his name or beg for shelter from the storm. Emotional outbursts are the desperate, useless tools of the powerless. I calmly reached down and gathered the slick, wet plastic bags in my hands. I walked carefully down the flooded driveway, the freezing water seeping into my leather shoes toward my parked sedan. I opened the trunk, tossed the bags inside without a second thought, and settled into the dry leather of the driver's seat. I started the engine, turned the heater on maximum, and drove away from the property without casting a single glance in the rearview mirror. I navigated the slick, rain-washed city streets, moving deliberately through the heavy traffic, heading straight for the downtown commercial district. I pulled into the highly secure, brightly lit underground parking garage of a luxury boutique hotel. My attorney, Rebecca, had booked this exact executive suite under an untraceable corporate alias a full month ago. I never engage in a battle without securing an untouchable command center well in advance. I took the private keycard access elevator up to the top floor and unlocked the door to my room. The suite was immaculate, perfectly silent, and maintained at a comfortable, warm temperature. I dropped my wet coat onto a chair, walked directly over to the wide mahogany desk, and retrieved a specialized, heavily encrypted tablet from my briefcase. I powered the device on and entered a complex, rolling alphanumeric sequence to bypass the biometric security. The dark screen immediately illuminated, splitting into a crisp grid of 12 high-definition live video feeds. I had personally wired the covert military-grade surveillance system deep into the drywall and ventilation ducts of my house exactly 1 year prior. I spent my entire career uncovering elaborate corporate theft, and my professional instincts triggered the very day Vanessa first moved in and began casually measuring my square footage. I knew she was actively calculating the total resale value of my property while I was still breathing in the living room. I installed the microscopic pinhole cameras to document the exact moment her passive greed transitioned into active criminality. The house was no longer a home. It was a fully monitored, self-contained evidence collection facility, and I held the only master access key in my hands. I leaned back in the ergonomic desk chair and focused my attention entirely on the live feed broadcasting from my locked study. The room was bathed in the harsh, blinding artificial glare of a portable halogen work light Vanessa had dragged in from the garage. She was absolutely not sleeping tonight. The imminent, unavoidable threat of a federal prison sentence and absolute financial ruin had stripped away her polished, arrogant corporate disguise entirely. She paced the hardwood floor like a rabid, cornered predator, her eyes darting aggressively around the shadowed corners of the room. She knew the decoy safe had triggered her downfall, which meant the real assets had to be physically buried somewhere else inside this exact space. She abruptly stopped pacing and locked her crazed gaze onto a massive antique oil painting of a maritime storm hanging securely on the far wall. It was Evelyn's favorite piece, an heirloom that had hung there for 20 years. Vanessa marched out of the camera's view for 30 seconds and returned wielding a heavy industrial steel sledgehammer with a long yellow fiberglass handle. She did not bother lifting the painting off its brass hooks. She swung the heavy hammer backward with tremendous force and drove the solid steel head directly through the painted canvas and into the thick drywall behind it. The violent impact sent a massive cloud of white plaster dust exploding into the stale air. She swung again and again with a feral, terrifying intensity, tearing the wall to shreds. The drywall completely crumbled, revealing the reinforced wooden structural studs and a massive dull gray steel safe embedded directly into the foundational concrete of the house. The hidden safe was a military-grade vault secured by a complex digital biometric keypad and a specialized titanium locking mechanism. Vanessa dropped the sledgehammer onto the floorboards, breathing heavily as the dust settled around her. She stared at the imposing steel door with a manic, obsessive hunger burning in her eyes. She screamed Jordan's name at the top of her lungs, ordering him to bring her the heavy cutting equipment from his workbench. Minutes later, she returned holding a heavy-duty angle grinder fitted with a diamond-tipped cutting wheel designed to slice through solid metal. She plugged the thick black cord into the wall outlet, flipped the power switch, and pressed the aggressively spinning blade directly against the digital lock. A massive, brilliant shower of bright orange sparks erupted across the study, illuminating her manic, sweating face in the dark room. She was entirely willing to burn the house down to reach what she desperately believed was her salvation. The glowing screen of my encrypted tablet illuminated the dark hotel suite. I sat perfectly still in the ergonomic chair, sipping a cup of black coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Through the high-definition lens hidden inside the study ventilation duct, I watched the brutal, grueling reality of Vanessa's desperation unfold in real time. 6 agonizing hours had passed since she first plugged in the heavy-duty angle grinder. The study, once my sanctuary of quiet reflection, was entirely decimated. A thick, choking haze of pulverized drywall and vaporized metal hung stagnant in the air. Vanessa's designer blouse was completely ruined, soaked in sweat, and covered in dark, greasy soot. Her hands trembled violently from the relentless, bone-rattling vibration of the power tool. She had burned through 5 separate diamond-tipped cutting wheels, tossing the scorched husks onto my ruined Persian rug. The deafening, high-pitched scream of grinding steel dominated the audio feed, masking the sound of her ragged, exhausted breathing. She pressed her entire body weight against the grinder, forcing the blade deep into the locking mechanism of the military-grade vault. A massive plume of bright orange sparks sprayed across the room, singeing the edges of the scattered papers she had recklessly tossed aside earlier. She refused to stop. Her obsession fueled a manic, terrifying stamina. The heavy steel groaned in protest. The intense friction had superheated the metal around the digital keypad, warping the internal locking pins. With a final violent shriek, the cutting wheel snapped the primary titanium deadbolt. The grinder kicked back aggressively, nearly tearing out of her exhausted grip. Vanessa dropped the heavy machine onto the floorboards. The spinning blade bit into the wood, kicking up a final cloud of dust before whining to a halt. The sudden silence in the study was absolute and deafening. Vanessa stood before the ruined safe, her chest heaving. She reached out with trembling, soot-stained fingers and grabbed the scorched steel handle. She planted her boots firmly against the broken drywall and pulled with all her remaining strength. The heavy vault door let out a deep, metallic screech. It swung open, revealing the dark, cavernous interior. Vanessa dropped to her knees, her eyes wide with a feral, starved anticipation. She reached her hands into the shadows, expecting to find stacks of gold bullion-bearer bonds or stacks of $100 bills. Instead, the interior lighting of the safe clicked on, illuminating the vault's contents. There was no money, there were no paper deeds. The massive steel enclosure was entirely empty, save for a small, elevated pedestal in the exact center. Resting perfectly on a plush cushion of black velvet was a single, unmarked black USB drive. Vanessa stared at the tiny piece of plastic. The profound anticlimax paralyzed her. She reached forward and picked up the drive, holding it up to the harsh glare of the halogen work light. I watched her bewildered expression through the surveillance feed. Her confusion lasted only a few seconds before her deeply ingrained corporate greed constructed a new, thrilling narrative. I knew exactly what was running through her calculating mind. She operated in a modern financial world where physical cash was an antiquated concept. She looked at the black plastic casing and instantly concluded that an old, paranoid forensic accountant would never leave paper trails. She believed the drive held the encrypted access keys to a massive, hidden cryptocurrency wallet. She assumed it contained the digital codes to my entire untraceable net worth. It was the only logical explanation her arrogant brain could process. She scrambled to her feet, practically tripping over the heavy power cords, and rushed to the mahogany desk where she had set up her backup laptop. She booted the machine, her soot-stained fingers flying aggressively across the keyboard. She did not hesitate. She did not pause to consider the security implications of plugging an unknown device from a locked vault into her personal hardware. Her sheer arrogance blinded her to the possibility of a digital trap. She shoved the black USB drive directly into the side port of her laptop. I leaned forward in my hotel chair, watching the feed with absolute unwavering focus. The moment the metal connectors bridged, a silent, invisible execution commenced. The USB drive did not contain cryptocurrency keys. It did not hold any of my personal financial data. It carried a highly aggressive, custom-built malware protocol I had engineered specifically for her hardware architecture. Vanessa was a financial director. She handled millions in corporate pension funds. During my quiet months of retirement, I had noticed the subtle, unmistakable markers of embezzlement in her lavish spending habits. The designer bags, the luxury vehicles, the random, unexplained infusions of cash proved she was siphoning money from her employer's pension accounts, masking her theft behind complex corporate ledgers. She believed her digital tracks were completely hidden behind her company's firewalls. The USB drive was a hunter-killer program. The instant she plugged it in, the malware bypassed her basic operating system security and ruthlessly burrowed into her hard drive. It rapidly extracted her hidden encrypted ledgers, her private communication logs with offshore bankers, and the exact routing numbers of her illicit shell companies. I watched her stare at the blank screen, waiting for a file folder of wealth to magically appear. Instead, the malware operated invisibly in the background, compiling her entire history of corporate theft into a single, undeniable data packet. The program immediately established a secure, encrypted tunnel through her home internet connection. It began transmitting the massive file directly to the dedicated reporting servers of the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Vanessa impatiently tapped the tracking pad on her laptop, clearly frustrated that the supposed cryptocurrency files were not instantly popping up on her desktop. She muttered a sharp curse under her breath, leaning closer to the screen. Through the camera feed, I saw the ambient light of the monitor reflect off her sweaty, dirt-streaked face. Suddenly, her aggressive tapping stopped. The standard blue hue of her desktop background vanished. The screen abruptly flooded with a harsh, blinding crimson red. A single bold white text box materialized perfectly in the center of the display. I did not need to be in the room to read the words. I had written the code myself. The message flashed with a cold, merciless finality, stating the data was successfully transmitted and thanking her for her cooperation. Vanessa froze. Her eyes darted wildly across the red screen, trying to comprehend the catastrophic meaning behind the words. She instinctively moved her cursor, trying to close the window, trying to access her task manager to force a shutdown. The keyboard was completely locked. The mouse was entirely unresponsive. The malware had seized total administrative control of the machine, locking her out of her own device. A progress bar appeared directly beneath the text, showing a transmission status of 100%. The sheer terrifying reality of the trap crashed down upon her. She realized she had not unlocked my wealth. She had just freely handed over the meticulously hidden proof of her own corporate felonies to the federal government. Pure, unadulterated panic exploded within her. She let out a guttural shriek of terror. She slammed her hands against the keyboard, desperately mashing the keys in a futile attempt to reverse the irreversible. When the screen remained locked in its mocking crimson glow, she resorted to brute physical force. She grabbed the laptop cord and violently ripped the power supply straight out of the wall outlet. The sudden force tore the plastic faceplate right off the drywall. She snatched the laptop with both hands and forcefully slammed the screen shut, panting heavily, her chest heaving with sheer terror. She ripped the black USB drive from the port and threw it across the room. But severing the power meant absolutely nothing. The digital payload had already reached its destination. The federal servers had successfully logged her IP address and permanently archived her stolen ledgers. The heavy silence of the ruined study returned, but it was suffocating now. Vanessa stood over the closed laptop, her entire body shaking uncontrollably as the inescapable weight of her immediate future settled heavily upon her shoulders. She had engineered her own absolute destruction. I sat back in the quiet comfort of my hotel suite, watching her hyperventilate on the live feed. Then the auditory shift occurred. It started as a faint, distant hum piercing the quiet dawn. The sound steadily grew louder, cutting through the morning fog outside my old house. The distinct high-pitched wail of multiple police sirens echoed from the far end of the street, rapidly approaching the property. The Financial Crimes Division works with remarkable speed when presented with an undeniable, fully packaged confession. The trap had permanently closed. The flashing red and blue lights swept across the rain-slicked driveway, casting harsh, strobing shadows against the shattered drywall of my study. Through the surveillance feed, I watched two uniformed officers approach the front door with flashlights drawn, their hands resting cautiously on their leather duty belts. They did not burst through the entrance with drawn weapons or federal warrants. The federal wire fraud machinery operates with bureaucratic precision, requiring days to process a digital data dump into a physical arrest. The immediate police presence was an entirely different maneuver. Vanessa had dialed emergency services the very second she realized the malware had successfully locked her machine. She met the officers on the porch, playing the role of a terrified, victimized daughter-in-law to absolute perfection. She was trembling, weeping with manufactured hysteria, clutching her expensive designer cardigan tightly around her shoulders to ward off the morning chill. She led the officers directly into the ruined study, pointing a manicured, soot-stained finger at the empty steel vault and the scorched angle grinder resting on the floorboards. She did not confess to tearing the wall apart. She explicitly claimed that I had suffered a severe psychotic break, violently dismantled my own house, and fled into the night. Her performance escalated seamlessly into a heavily fabricated accusation of cyber terrorism. She told the officers that her father-in-law was a deeply paranoid retired forensic accountant who had illegally tapped her personal laptop. She filed a formal police report stating I had planted a highly sophisticated malware virus designed to frame her for financial crimes she never committed. She wove a narrative characterizing me as a dangerous, technically proficient predator who had hijacked her corporate accounts to cover up my own senile delusions. She provided my license plate number, the make of my sedan, and a completely fabricated list of my supposed mental health medications. She warned the officers that I was mentally unstable, highly paranoid, and potentially armed, deliberately escalating the routine police response from a simple wellness check to an active high-alert manhunt. Her smear campaign was a masterful, desperate pivot, turning her own crime scene into the staging ground for my destruction, buying herself the exact window of chaos she desperately needed. Less than 45 minutes later, two plainclothes detectives stood outside the door of my downtown hotel suite. I had expected them. I did not make them knock twice. I opened the door fully dressed in a crisp, pressed suit projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable calm that stood in stark contrast to the deranged profile Vanessa had just painted for them. The lead detective, a heavily built man with tired eyes, placed his hand flat against the doorframe and asked to step inside, clearly anticipating a chaotic confrontation with a mentally unstable cyber criminal. I invited them into the immaculate, brightly lit room and directed their attention to the wide mahogany desk. I did not offer frantic denials or defensive explanations. I simply reached into my leather briefcase and handed the lead detective a thickly bound 300-page dossier. I explained that they were currently holding a meticulously executed, legally binding forensic audit of Vanessa's corporate accounts. I had not spent my recent retirement feeding pigeons or watching television. I had spent the last 6 consecutive months tracking every single fraudulent transaction, offshore wire transfer, and manipulated ledger my daughter-in-law had touched. I detailed the precise methodology I used to uncover her embezzlement, utilizing my remaining corporate credentials and legal access protocols to silently map her entire network of shell companies. The detectives flipped through the pages, their initial skepticism rapidly evaporating as they absorbed the sheer, undeniable volume of financial evidence. The columns of stolen pension funds, the routing numbers, the matching dates, everything was completely documented, mathematically verified, and cross-referenced with federal tax records. I clarified the nature of the black USB drive resting in my ruined study. It was never an illegal hacking tool or a piece of malicious cyber weaponry. It was a legally authorized data collection script designed specifically to match the internal financial records against her physical hardware, thereby establishing an unbreakable chain of custody for the federal prosecutors. The malware was a mirror reflecting her undeniable guilt directly to the authorities. The second detective slowly lowered his notepad, realizing that the weeping woman who had called them was not a victim of a senile hacker. She was a highly sophisticated embezzler attempting to use the police department as a shield against a federal indictment. The dense stack of paper in their hands completely dismantled her elaborate smear campaign in less than 10 minutes. I watched the heavy realization set in as the detectives understood they had been aggressively manipulated by a cornered felon. The detectives did not waste another second in my hotel suite. The lead investigator snapped his radio off his belt, immediately dispatching uniform units to secure the perimeter of my property, while he and his partner sprinted toward the elevator to execute a felony arrest for filing a false police report and grand larceny. I remained perfectly still, returning my focus to the encrypted surveillance tablet resting on the desk. The live feeds from my house painted a grim, chaotic picture of the immediate aftermath. The police cruisers arrived back at my address with their sirens silenced, intending to catch Vanessa completely off guard. They drew their weapons and approached the porch, only to find the heavy oak front door hanging wide open, swinging lazily in the freezing morning wind. The foyer was completely abandoned. I switched the camera angles, tracking through the living room, the kitchen, and the master bedroom. The house had been brutally ransacked. The detectives moved cautiously through the shattered study, sweeping their flashlights across the empty floorboards, but their targets were already gone. Vanessa had never intended to wait for the police to validate her lies. The emergency call was nothing more than a highly calculated distraction designed exclusively to tie up the local authorities while she orchestrated her escape. I watched the recorded playback of the last 20 minutes. The exact moment the initial officers left the property to hunt me down, Vanessa had grabbed Jordan by the arm and dragged him upstairs. They had systematically ripped through my personal belongings, tearing open drawers and overturning mattresses. They emptied the emergency cash reserves I kept hidden beneath the floorboards of the guest room. But the deepest, most unforgivable violation occurred in the master closet. The footage showed Jordan, my own flesh and blood, violently smashing the delicate wooden lockbox that held his mother's belongings. He scooped up Evelyn's irreplaceable heirloom jewelry, the diamond pendant, her platinum wedding band, and the vintage pearl necklace, shoving them carelessly into a canvas duffel bag alongside stacks of stolen cash. They had abandoned the house, fleeing the city limits with everything of material and emotional value they could carry. The trap had successfully exposed Vanessa's corporate crimes, but it had also unleashed a desperate feral couple who now had absolutely nothing left to lose. The pursuit had officially transitioned from a quiet financial siege into a high-stakes, extremely dangerous manhunt. The heavy deluge of freezing rain severely impaired visibility on the interstate, but Jordan pushed the engine of his luxury sedan to its absolute limit. He gripped the leather steering wheel with white-knuckled terror, weaving recklessly between massive transport trucks, while Vanessa frantically sorted through the stolen cash and jewelry in the passenger seat. Their chaotic flight hit an immovable concrete wall less than 40 miles outside the city limits. The digital fuel gauge dipped dangerously close to empty, forcing Jordan to aggressively veer off the highway and skid into a brightly lit 24-hour fueling station. Vanessa snatched her platinum corporate credit card from her wallet and shoved it into the pump's payment terminal. The digital screen instantly flashed a stark red notification declaring the transaction was declined. She cursed violently, retrieving a second card and then a third. Every single account was completely frozen by the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The realization that her entire digital net worth had been seized hit her with physical force. Before she could fully process the magnitude of her financial paralysis, the crackle of a police radio echoed through the heavy rain. A highway patrol cruiser idled near the station exit, its automated license plate reader actively scanning the lot. Jordan saw the officer's brake lights illuminate. He knew instantly that the federal wire fraud warrant had triggered a statewide alert on his vehicle registration. Blind panic completely overrode his logic. He threw the car into reverse, abandoning the gas pump, and violently accelerated down a dark, unpaved service road running parallel to the interstate. They drove blindly into the rural darkness until the engine sputtered and died just outside the city outskirts. Their only refuge was a dilapidated, cash-only roadside motel hidden behind a barrier of overgrown pine trees. Jordan handed the apathetic night clerk a crumpled stack of stolen bills and received a rusted brass key in return. They dragged the heavy canvas duffel bag containing Evelyn's priceless heirlooms into a room reeking of stale cigarette smoke and industrial bleach. Cockroaches scattered across the stained, peeling linoleum floor as Vanessa dropped her ruined designer jacket onto a sagging, mold-spotted mattress. The affluent, untouchable corporate director and her compliant husband were now officially reduced to desperate fugitives hiding in absolute squalor. The call of the coward. I remained seated at the mahogany desk in my secure hotel suite, watching the rain beat steadily against the reinforced glass window. My mobile phone vibrated sharply against the polished wood. The caller identification displayed an untraceable prepaid burner number, but I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. I answered the call and placed the device on speaker mode, maintaining absolute, unwavering silence. Jordan's ragged, pathetic sobbing instantly filled the quiet room. He wept with the same theatrical, highly rehearsed desperation he used when he crashed my vehicle at 17 and blamed the wet pavement. He begged me to contact the federal prosecutors and drop all charges immediately. He swore entirely to God that he was an innocent victim of his wife's psychotic greed. He desperately offered to file for divorce first thing in the morning, promising to completely abandon Vanessa to the federal authorities if I would simply provide him with a legal alibi and a safe harbor. He claimed he only broke into the safe and stole his mother's irreplaceable heirloom jewelry because Vanessa threatened to have him killed by the underground syndicate. I listened to his frantic, cowardly bargaining, meticulously analyzing the exact tone of his voice. He felt absolutely zero genuine remorse for desecrating Evelyn's memory or attempting to throw me onto the street in a freezing storm. He was solely experiencing the terror of facing actual severe consequences for the very first time in his sheltered life. In the background of the call, the chaotic audio of the filthy motel room painted a vivid picture of their rapidly unraveling alliance. I heard the sharp, violent crash of a glass bottle shattering against a wall. Vanessa was screaming at the top of her lungs, unleashing a torrent of vicious, feral profanities directly at Jordan. She shrieked that he was a spineless failure who had permanently ruined her immaculate life and destroyed her career. Her manic rage provided the perfect, indisputable confirmation of their mutual destruction. Jordan pleaded with me one final time, crying out that he was my only son, and I had a fundamental moral obligation to protect him from federal prison. He demanded salvation while entirely refusing to accept a single ounce of accountability. The digital martyr. I reached forward and firmly tapped the red icon on the digital screen, permanently terminating the phone call and severing Jordan's final connection to my world. I did not block the number. I simply forwarded all subsequent communication attempts directly to the dedicated voicemail inbox established by my attorney. I picked up my coffee cup intending to review the final pages of the forensic audit when a loud, rapid succession of emergency alert chimes erupted from my encrypted tablet. The notifications were not originating from the covert surveillance system wired into my house. They were massive, synchronized alerts from global social media monitoring software Rebecca had activated to track Vanessa's digital footprint. I opened the primary application and immediately saw a live video broadcast dominating the trending algorithms across multiple platforms. Vanessa had utilized the motel's unsecured internet connection to launch a highly calculated, utterly ruthless public relations strike. The video quality was grainy, filmed under the flickering, sickly yellow light of the cheap motel bathroom. Vanessa stared directly into the camera lens. She had expertly applied dark bruised-colored makeup around her left eye and across the right side of her jawline. Her hair was deliberately tangled and heavy tears streamed continuously down her face. She looked directly at the millions of viewers tuning in and delivered a masterful, chillingly convincing performance. She claimed with a shaking, traumatized voice that I was a violent, domineering patriarch who had physically and psychologically abused her for years. She told the camera that I exerted total, tyrannical control over the family finances, forcing her and Jordan to live in constant, paralyzing fear of my explosive rage. She explicitly stated that the federal fraud charges were entirely fabricated by me, claiming I used my immense wealth and corrupt corporate connections to frame an innocent woman. She sobbed heavily, telling the audience she had to flee into the night with nothing but the clothes on her back because I had threatened to end her life if she exposed my supposed corruption to the authorities. The internet mob operates on immediate blind emotion rather than verified facts or logical deduction. Within 10 minutes, the video had amassed over 3 million views. The comments section exploded into a torrential flood of pure, unadulterated hatred directed entirely at me. Vanessa had brilliantly weaponized public sympathy, transforming herself into a battered martyr and setting the entire digital world on a rabid, unforgiving hunt for my destruction. The bright morning sun pierced the heavy curtains of my executive suite, but the outside world had already descended into absolute chaos. I stood near the reinforced glass window, looking down at the street level. A dozen satellite news vans had completely blockaded the hotel entrance. Reporters armed with microphones and glaring camera lights swarmed the revolving doors, aggressively questioning the security staff. Vanessa's fabricated video had ignited a digital wildfire overnight. My mobile phone sat on the mahogany desk, vibrating with a relentless, sickening rhythm. The device was flooded with hundreds of anonymous death threats, vicious text messages, and voicemails from absolute strangers demanding vigilante justice. They promised to burn my hotel down. They threatened to drag me into the street. The internet mob had eagerly swallowed her performance, instantly transforming me into a tyrannical monster. My lifelong reputation as an honorable, meticulous forensic accountant was being brutally shredded on every major broadcast network. The news anchors repeated her lies verbatim, treating her poorly lit motel confession as absolute gospel. They broadcast my name, my face, and my former corporate credentials to millions of outraged viewers. They painted a picture of a wealthy, abusive patriarch who used his vast resources to frame an innocent woman and force her into hiding. Vanessa had played the ultimate victim card, weaponizing public sympathy to build an impenetrable shield against her imminent federal indictment. She assumed the overwhelming media pressure would force me to retract the evidence or negotiate a public settlement to save my legacy. She wanted me to panic, to rush down to the lobby and scream my innocence to an audience that had already condemned me. She fundamentally misunderstood how a man who spent his life dismantling corporate fraud operates under intense pressure. I did not flinch at the sight of the news vans. I did not care about the anonymous voices screaming through my voicemail inbox. A reputation built on a lifetime of integrity cannot be permanently destroyed by a desperate fleeing felon. I turned away from the window and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, ignoring the flashing notifications on my screen. The media storm was merely a temporary illusion of power, and I possessed the absolute truth required to shatter it. The suite door opened with a sharp click and Rebecca stepped inside, her face set in a tight professional grimace. My attorney was clutching a thick stack of legal briefs, clearly agitated by the gauntlet of reporters she had just navigated. She dropped her leather briefcase onto the sofa and immediately urged me to counter the narrative. She demanded we book a conference room downstairs, assemble the press, and systematically dismantle Vanessa's lies on live television. Rebecca argued that remaining silent would only validate the mob's fury and permanently cement my guilt in the court of public opinion. I took a slow sip of my coffee and completely refused her request. I explained that arguing with a rabid emotional mob is a futile exercise that only feeds the chaotic spectacle they crave. Presenting logic to people who are addicted to outrage is a severe tactical error. I instructed Rebecca to ignore the news cameras entirely and focus her energy on the federal machinery we had already set into motion. I gave her a direct, unyielding order to immediately unseal the official Internal Revenue Service indictment against Vanessa. The digital trap I had sprung the previous night had not merely captured a few vague financial discrepancies. The malware had extracted the precise, highly encrypted ledgers proving exactly where Vanessa had sourced her stolen wealth. She had not stolen from wealthy executives or faceless corporate accounts. She had systematically drained the retirement funds of hundreds of working-class janitors and maintenance staff employed by her commercial real estate firm. She had quietly siphoned their meager pensions for years, transferring the money into her offshore shell companies to finance her luxury vehicles and designer wardrobe. I told Rebecca to release the raw, verified IRS audit directly to the major financial news outlets. The public did not need to hear my defensive excuses. They needed to see the cold, hard mathematics of her absolute greed. By unsealing the federal indictment, we would force the media to pivot from a fabricated domestic dispute to a massive verified corporate scandal affecting hundreds of innocent, hardworking families. I handed Rebecca the authorization forms and instructed her to let the federal evidence speak for itself. The release of the official federal documents struck the digital landscape with the force of a localized earthquake. Within an hour of Rebecca unsealing the IRS indictment, the entire narrative violently reversed course. The major news networks completely abandoned the story of the battered daughter-in-law and immediately began broadcasting the verified financial ledgers. The screen displayed undeniable proof of Vanessa stealing the life savings of the very maintenance workers who cleaned her corporate offices. The internet mob, realizing they had been aggressively manipulated, instantly turned their collective fury onto Vanessa. Her fabricated public support disintegrated into absolute nothingness. Social media platforms were flooded with overwhelming rage from her former employees, who organized immediate protests demanding her swift and brutal arrest. The digital shield she had so carefully constructed was completely vaporized, leaving her entirely exposed to the crushing weight of federal prosecution and public hatred. Through the covert surveillance feeds still tracking her digital footprint, I watched her world permanently collapse. She was trapped in that filthy, roach-infested motel room with Jordan watching the news anchors detail her specific federal charges. She had absolutely no exit strategy left. Her accounts were frozen, her reputation was radioactive, and her impending prison sentence was a mathematical certainty. She paced the cramped motel bathroom, her eyes wide with a frantic, lethal desperation. A cornered predator stripped of all its resources relies on pure instinctual violence. Vanessa grabbed the canvas duffel bag containing Evelyn's stolen heirloom jewelry and the last remnants of their stolen cash. She pulled out a burner phone and began making rapid, frantic calls to the very underground loan shark enforcers who were actively hunting her husband. She did not call to pay off Jordan's massive debts. She used her final hidden cash reserves to strike a completely different bargain. She offered the violent local thugs every last dollar in the bag to locate my downtown hotel, breach the security perimeter, and physically kidnap me. The white-collar corporate fraud had officially mutated into an imminent physical threat, driving the conflict straight toward a brutal, violent collision. The transition from deep restorative sleep to sudden absolute violence was instantaneous. I was resting in the king-sized bed of the executive suite, my mind finally quieting after the chaotic events of the day, when a deafening explosive crash obliterated the silence of the room. The reinforced double-paned glass of the suite's private balcony doors shattered completely, raining thousands of jagged, glittering shards across the carpeted floor. The heavy velvet curtains were violently torn aside, letting the freezing, howling night wind rush directly into the warm room. Before I could even throw off the heavy duvet or reach for the bedside lamp, 3 massive figures dressed entirely in tactical black clothing breached the threshold. They moved with a frantic, aggressive energy, their boots crunching loudly over the broken glass. I did not scream or attempt to fight them blindly in the dark. I recognized the sheer physical disadvantage of a 70-year-old man against 3 adrenaline-fueled attackers. Rough, leather-gloved hands grabbed my shoulders, hauling me violently out of the bed. I was thrown roughly across the room, landing hard against the solid mahogany desk chair. My breath caught in my chest as the impact bruised my ribs, but my mind remained perfectly sharp and detached. These men did not move with the disciplined, silent precision of trained professional operatives. They were sloppy breathing, heavily bumping into the furniture and swearing aggressively under their breath. They smelled of cheap tobacco, damp polyester, and raw desperation. One of the men shoved my head downward while another aggressively yanked my arms behind the rigid wooden back of the chair. The sharp, unmistakable sound of thick plastic zip ties ratcheting shut echoed in the room. The rigid plastic bit deeply into the fragile skin of my wrists, cutting off the circulation almost immediately. The third man, clearly the leader of this chaotic operation, stepped directly into my line of sight. He pulled a heavy metallic handgun from his waistband and racked the slide with an exaggerated theatrical motion designed entirely to induce absolute terror. He pressed the freezing steel barrel directly against my right temple. The cold metal sent a sharp shockwave through my nervous system, but I forced my breathing to remain slow and measured. Panic was the exact reaction they were relying on to force my compliance, and I completely refused to give them that satisfaction. The leader leaned in close, his face obscured by a black fabric mask, and aggressively slapped a crumpled, rain-dampened stack of legal documents onto the surface of the mahogany desk. He barked a furious command, ordering me to sign the total asset transfer paperwork immediately, or he would scatter my brains across the hotel wallpaper. He claimed the documents legally surrendered my entire estate, my liquid assets, and my offshore holding companies to an anonymous corporate entity. Vanessa and Jordan had clearly dispatched these street-level thugs with a desperate, half-baked legal strategy, operating under the delusional assumption that a contract signed at gunpoint would somehow hold up against a massive federal fraud indictment. I did not flinch. I did not beg for my life, nor did I reach for the pen he shoved aggressively into my bound hands. I sat perfectly still, letting the cold steel of the gun rest heavily against my skull. I looked past the weapon and stared directly into the eyes of the man holding it. I observed the specific tattoo peeking out from the collar of his black shirt, the distinct scar cutting through his left eyebrow, and the cheap, oversized watch strapped to his wrist. I took a slow, steady breath and spoke in a voice completely devoid of fear. I calmly recited his full legal name, Marcus Vance. The heavy gun barrel wavered slightly against my temple. I did not stop. I listed his current residential address down to the exact apartment number on the south side of the city. I recited the precise, crushing amount of his outstanding mortgage debt, detailing the 90 days of missed payments and the imminent bank foreclosure scheduled for the following Tuesday. I had not spent my weeks of preparation solely focusing on Vanessa's corporate embezzlement. I had meticulously investigated every single criminal contact loan shark and underground enforcer Jordan had ever interacted with. I had mapped their financial vulnerabilities, their physical addresses, and their desperate motivations. I explained to the trembling man holding the gun that the jewelry and cash he received as payment for this kidnapping were actively being tracked by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I told him he was risking a federal life sentence in a penitentiary for a man who did not even have the courage to break into the hotel room himself. The absolute chilling precision of my knowledge struck the thug with physical force. His eyes widened in sheer unadulterated terror as he realized the helpless old man tied to the chair held total, unrestricted dominion over his entire life. The psychological power dynamic in the room inverted instantly. Before the terrified leader could utter a single word in response, the heavy reinforced oak door of the hotel suite was violently kicked open from the hallway. The thick wooden frame splintered instantly, sending a shower of wood chips flying across the entryway. Rebecca had not merely booked me a luxury suite for comfort. She had secured a highly fortified defensive perimeter. A half-dozen heavily armed, truly professional private security contractors swarmed into the room with absolute terrifying efficiency. They moved in perfect synchronized silence, their high-lumen tactical flashlights cutting through the darkness and completely blinding the amateur thugs. The contractors did not hesitate or issue warnings. They executed a swift, brutal takedown. The leader was tackled forcefully to the carpet, the handgun kicked far out of his reach before he could even process the breach. His two accomplices were slammed against the drywall and pinned to the floorboards with heavy combat boots pressed firmly against their spines. The chaotic invasion was entirely neutralized in less than 10 seconds. I sat calmly in the wooden chair as a contractor stepped forward and swiftly snipped the agonizing plastic zip ties from my bruised wrists. The wail of approaching police sirens instantly filled the night air outside the shattered window. The local authorities, coordinated directly by Rebecca, poured into the suite moments later to take official physical custody of the subdued attackers. The leader of the thugs, his face pressed harshly into the carpet and his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, completely abandoned whatever fragile loyalty he held toward my son. Faced with the immediate inescapable reality of severe federal kidnapping charges and armed robbery, he began screaming a frantic, desperate confession to the arresting officers. He wailed that Jordan and Vanessa had approached him hours ago, paying him with a duffel bag stuffed with stolen antique jewelry and wet cash. He confessed that they had orchestrated the entire violent raid as a last-ditch effort to extort my signature before fleeing the state. The police lieutenant standing over him immediately relayed the recorded confession through his shoulder radio directly to the federal task force. The local kidnapping charge instantly elevated the situation into a massive federal fugitive manhunt. The police radio crackled with a sharp static response officially confirming that federal arrest warrants for grand larceny, extortion, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping had just been issued for Jordan and Vanessa. Their final violent gamble had failed spectacularly, permanently sealing their absolute destruction. The harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the underground police parking garage cast long, sickly yellow shadows across the damp concrete. I had just spent 3 hours on the upper floors of the precinct, systematically walking federal investigators through the precise timeline of the midnight raid and handing over the recorded confession of Marcus Vance. The air in the subterranean level was heavy with the thick, suffocating smell of motor oil and cold exhaust. My footsteps echoed sharply against the cement walls as I walked toward my sedan, a solitary sound in the cavernous empty space. I unlocked the vehicle with a remote click, the headlights flashing briefly against the dim surroundings. Before my hand could even touch the metal door handle, a ragged, trembling figure detached itself from the deep shadow of a massive concrete support pillar. It was Jordan. The federal fugitive had somehow bypassed the exterior security perimeter. Driven by a desperation so absolute, it had completely overridden his basic survival instincts. He did not approach me with violence or anger. He collapsed instantly, his knees striking the oily concrete floor with a heavy, sickening thud. The physical deterioration he had suffered in just a matter of days was startling. He looked severely emaciated, his cheekbones jutting sharply against his pale, unwashed skin. The expensive tailored clothing he normally paraded around in was heavily soiled, damp with rain, and reeking of the filthy motel room where they had been hiding. He clasped his trembling hands together in front of his chest, completely surrendering whatever fragmented shards of pride he had left. Jordan began to speak, his voice a frantic, breathless whisper echoing through the cold garage. He wept openly, tears cutting through the grime on his face as he launched into a desperate, pathetic monologue. He swore on his life that the entire kidnapping plot was exclusively Vanessa's design. He claimed she had entirely lost her mind after the federal asset freeze, transforming into a violent, unhinged dictator who forced him to participate under the threat of physical harm. He painted himself as a terrified hostage, a compliant victim dragged along by a woman consumed by corporate greed and feral rage. He begged me to walk back upstairs and tell the federal agents that he was innocent, pleading that a man of my influence could easily shield his own flesh and blood from a prison sentence. He promised to sign divorce papers immediately, offering to testify against his wife in federal court if I simply provided him with the financial and legal protection he needed to survive. I stood perfectly still next to the driver's side door, watching him grovel on the filthy floor. I did not interrupt his frantic performance. I simply opened the brass latch of the leather briefcase I had carried down from the precinct. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized stack of printed telecommunication records. I held the documents out, letting the harsh overhead light illuminate the rows of highlighted data. I looked down at my son and methodically dismantled his final, desperate lie. I explained that federal fraud investigations require total digital transparency, giving me unrestricted access to cross-reference their communication logs. The papers in my hand were the subpoenaed call records from his personal cellular device. I pointed to a specific highlighted cluster of outgoing calls directed to the untraceable burner phone owned by Marcus Vance. I read the dates aloud, letting the cold, undeniable mathematics of the data wash over him. The very first call Jordan placed to the violent underground enforcer occurred a full 30 days before Vanessa even plugged the angle grinder into the study wall. Long before the financial trap was sprung, long before their bank accounts were frozen, Jordan had been actively pricing out violent criminals. He had recognized the imminent threat my forensic audit posed to his lavish, unearned lifestyle, and he had independently sought out a crew of thugs to handle his father. He was not a hostage to his wife's madness. He was the original architect of the violence. The realization that I possessed the exact chronological proof of his murderous intent hit him with the force of a physical blow. The frantic pleading instantly died in his throat. His mouth hung open, his eyes widening in absolute paralyzing terror as the inescapable reality of his situation crashed down upon him. He had brought a fabricated story of victimhood to a man who relied exclusively on verified data. I did not offer him a single word of anger, disappointment, or paternal grief. The time for emotional confrontation had expired the moment he hired men to put a gun to my head. I returned the stack of phone records to my briefcase, snapped the brass latch shut, and opened the car door. Jordan scrambled forward on his knees, his hands reaching out to grab the hem of my coat, screaming my name with a raw, guttural panic. I stepped into the vehicle and slammed the heavy door shut completely, severing the physical connection between us. I turned the ignition key. The powerful engine roared to life, the deep mechanical hum entirely drowning out the sound of his frantic, muffled screams through the safety glass. I shifted the transmission into drive and pressed the accelerator. I did not look back in the rearview mirror as I left him kneeling in the thick cloud of gray exhaust fumes, a broken, terrified fugitive waiting in a police parking lot for the federal agents to inevitably find him. The sedan moved smoothly across the concrete, the headlights cutting through the gloom as I navigated toward the steep, curved exit ramp leading back up to the street level. The heavy rain was still pouring relentlessly outside, cascading down the open concrete incline. The ramp was narrow and closed by high cinder-block walls that offered zero visibility around the sharp upward curve. I accelerated steadily, eager to leave the precinct and return to the absolute security of my hotel suite. As the front tires hit the wet incline, a dark, drenched figure lunged violently from the blind spot of the concrete wall, stepping directly into the path of the headlights. It was Vanessa. She was entirely soaked, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide with a manic homicidal fury that had pushed her completely past the brink of sanity. She had not come to beg, and she had not come to negotiate. She raised a solid, heavy steel tire iron high above her head, her muscles coiled tight with sheer adrenaline. She did not aim for the tires or the engine block. As the car moved forward, she swung the massive steel bar with every ounce of her remaining strength, aiming the devastating blow directly at the center of the windshield, right in line with my face. The heavy iron crashed into the reinforced glass with a deafening explosive crack. The reinforced safety glass held for a fraction of a second before spiderwebbing into 1,000 blinding fractures. The structural integrity failed under the sheer kinetic force of the heavy steel tire iron. The massive metal bar punched directly through the center of the windshield, dragging a shower of razor-sharp geometric shards into the cabin of the sedan. I threw my right arm up in a rigid defensive posture, turning my torso sharply toward the passenger seat to protect my face. The jagged, rusted edge of the iron bar bypassed my defensive guard and tore violently into my left shoulder. The heavy impact ripped through the wool of my suit jacket and bit deeply into the muscle tissue beneath. A sudden searing wave of heat radiated from the open wound as blood immediately began to soak the crisp white fabric of my dress shirt. The vehicle lurched to an abrupt halt, the tires skidding harshly against the damp concrete of the exit ramp. Standing directly in front of the ruined hood of my car, Vanessa was entirely unrecognizable. The pristine, calculating corporate director had been entirely consumed by a feral, unadulterated madness. She gripped the steel tire iron with both hands, panting heavily, her soaked hair plastered against her pale skin. Her eyes were completely devoid of reason, burning with a pure, concentrated hatred. She slammed the heavy bar against the crumpled hood of the sedan, leaving deep, jagged dents in the metal frame. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing violently through the subterranean concrete cavern. She shrieked that I had systematically destroyed her immaculate life, blaming my forensic interference for dismantling her perfect corporate facade. She cursed my name, spitting vitriol, and blaming my wealth for her current destitution. She possessed no concept of personal accountability. In her fractured mind, her theft of the working-class pension funds was a completely justified entitlement, and my refusal to surrender my estate was the ultimate, unforgivable crime. She raised the heavy iron bar a third time, preparing to swing it through the shattered gap in the windshield to finish the assault. She wanted to physically obliterate the man who had exposed her hidden reality. Her breath formed harsh, ragged clouds in the freezing, damp air of the garage as she prepared her final, desperate strike. Before she could deliver the final crushing blow, the underground parking garage erupted into a chaotic storm of tactical precision. The proximity of the attack to the police precinct proved to be her ultimate catastrophic miscalculation. A dozen uniformed officers poured out of the precinct's secure lower entrance, sprinting across the wet concrete with their weapons drawn and tactical flashlights blinding the immediate area. They swarmed the exit ramp in a highly coordinated tactical formation, cutting off any possible avenue of escape. Two heavy-set precinct officers tackled Vanessa violently to the ground from behind. The heavy steel tire iron clattered uselessly across the damp floorboards as her body slammed forcefully onto the cold, oily cement. She did not surrender gracefully. She fought the arresting officers like a trapped wild animal, thrashing her limbs aggressively and kicking blindly at their armored legs. She contorted her body against the concrete, spitting vicious, unfiltered curses directly at my vehicle, while the officers forced her arms behind her back and secured them with heavy steel handcuffs. I sat perfectly still inside the driver's seat of the ruined sedan, maintaining an absolute, unshakable calm, despite the chaos unfolding inches from my face. I reached into the breast pocket of my torn suit jacket with my uninjured right hand and extracted a clean, folded linen handkerchief. I pressed the thick white fabric firmly against the deep gash in my left shoulder, applying steady, calculated pressure to stem the heavy flow of arterial blood. The physical pain was sharp, a burning reminder of her desperate violence, but my mind remained absolute steel. I watched through the shattered, spider-webbed windshield as the officers hauled the struggling, shrieking woman to her feet. They physically dragged her toward a waiting squad car, ignoring her frantic demands and fabricated claims of victimization. They shoved her forcefully into the caged back seat, slamming the heavy reinforced door shut and permanently trapping her inside. Her smear campaign, her violent intimidation, and her desperate physical assault had all completely failed to break my resolve. I had absorbed her absolute worst attempt at destruction and remained entirely unmoved. I watched the squad car speed toward the upper holding cells, knowing her isolation was now absolute and irreversible. Deep inside the heavily fortified upper levels of the police precinct, the harsh reality of the criminal justice system systematically dismantled the final remnants of their toxic partnership. The lead detectives placed Jordan and Vanessa into completely separate soundproof interrogation rooms, isolating them from one another to prevent any coordination of their fabricated narratives. The rooms were cold, windowless, and illuminated by glaring, unforgiving fluorescent lights designed to break down a suspect's psychological defenses. Vanessa sat in her designated room, stubbornly clinging to her manufactured victim complex. She demanded legal representation, refusing to speak without a high-priced corporate defense attorney entirely delusional about her frozen financial assets. She believed Jordan would maintain his silence, assuming their years of shared deceit would bind him to her defense. She severely misjudged the sheer, unadulterated cowardice of the man she had married. In the adjacent interrogation room, Jordan completely collapsed under the sheer weight of his immediate circumstances. He did not ask for a lawyer to coordinate a mutual defense. He did not spend a single second considering his wife's legal exposure or her physical well-being. Faced with the undeniable reality of federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit kidnapping and aiding a violent physical assault, Jordan instantly prioritized his own survival above all else. When the federal prosecutor entered the room and presented a heavily structured plea agreement, Jordan grabbed the ink pen with frantic, trembling fingers. The document offered him a marginally lighter sentence in a minimum security federal facility in exchange for his absolute unconditional cooperation. Jordan signed the binding legal contract without a shred of hesitation. He eagerly offered to provide full, comprehensive testimony against Vanessa regarding the physical assault in the parking garage, the theft of the working-class pension funds, and the hiring of the underground enforcers. He willingly laid every single felony directly at her feet, detailing her meticulous planning and her violent execution to save his own skin. The dark parasitic alliance that had fueled their corporate greed and their relentless attacks against my estate was instantly and permanently dead. They had spent years manipulating others for their personal gain, but in the end, they enthusiastically destroyed one another to escape the consequences of their actions. The trap had closed, the final betrayals were recorded, and my absolute vindication was secured. Exactly 6 months had passed since the violent collision on the concrete exit ramp of the police precinct. The sprawling, high-ceilinged federal courtroom in the heart of the city was completely packed, filled to its absolute fire code capacity. The heavy oak doors had been locked by armed bailiffs, trapping the stifling, tense energy inside the chamber. The polished wooden benches of the public gallery provided a stark visual division of two entirely different worlds. On the left side sat a dense, aggressive wall of media personnel. Syndicated journalists, local reporters, and true crime documentarians sat shoulder to shoulder, their pens hovering eagerly over their legal pads, hungry for the final act of the most highly publicized corporate fraud case of the decade. On the right side sat the true collateral damage of Vanessa's unbounded greed. Dozens of former maintenance workers, janitors, and facility staff occupied the rows. These were the hard-working, calloused men and women whose modest retirement pensions had been ruthlessly siphoned to fund her luxury vehicles and offshore bank accounts. They watched the proceedings with cold, unforgiving eyes, demanding the absolute justice they had been denied for years. I sat at the plaintiff's bench, positioned directly across the center aisle from the defense table. I wore a sharply tailored dark charcoal suit, the crisp white collar of my shirt pressing firmly against my neck. I remained completely motionless, sitting as still as a carved marble statue. I did not fidget, I did not glance at the frantic reporters, and I did not acknowledge the hostile whispers echoing from the back rows. My composure was absolute. Directly across from me, Vanessa sat flanked by two exhausted public defenders. The 6 months inside a federal holding facility had systematically stripped away her immaculate corporate facade. Her designer wardrobe had been permanently replaced by a drab, oversized institutional uniform. Her posture was severely hunched, her hands trembling continuously as she nervously shredded a paper tissue under the desk. She was completely isolated, abandoned by her husband, stripped of her stolen wealth, and entirely cornered by the relentless machinery of the federal justice system. The lead defense attorney stood up from his chair and approached the jury box, launching into a desperate, heavily manufactured narrative. Knowing the financial evidence extracted by my malware was entirely irrefutable, he attempted to pivot the trial into a dramatic, emotional referendum. He paced the floor, gesturing sympathetically toward Vanessa, painting her not as a calculating financial predator, but as a deeply fragile woman, completely broken by severe clinical depression. He claimed she was pushed entirely to the psychological brink by a domineering, manipulative father-in-law who controlled every aspect of her existence. The attorney argued that the massive embezzlement was a frantic, manic cry for help, a desperate attempt to build a financial escape hatch to flee my supposed tyranny. He spun a fabricated tale of domestic terror, attempting to weaponize her tears to secure a lenient sentence. The jury listened with unreadable expressions as Vanessa buried her face in her hands, sobbing perfectly on cue. The moment the defense rested their emotional plea, Rebecca stood from the chair beside me. She did not raise her voice or offer a passionate rebuttal. She smoothly connected a digital media drive to the courtroom's central audio system. She explained to the judge that she was submitting unedited, time-stamped audio evidence. Months before the safe was ever breached, the very second I noticed the subtle, arrogant shifts in Vanessa's spending habits, I had planted a microscopic, voice-activated hidden recorder directly behind the headboard of the guest bedroom. The courtroom speakers hissed with a brief burst of static before Vanessa's voice filled the cavernous room. It was not the voice of a fragile, broken victim. It was terrifyingly cold, entirely sober, and mathematically precise. The jury heard her calculating exactly how many days of systematic gaslighting and sleep deprivation it would take to drive a 70-year-old man into a permanent psychiatric ward. She explicitly detailed the legal loopholes required to seize my estate, laughing softly as she outlined her plan to steal the house and liquidate my assets the very minute the hospital doors locked behind me. The recording played for 4 agonizing minutes. The stark, undeniable contrast between the weeping woman at the defense table and the ruthless, predatory voice echoing from the speakers instantly vaporized the defense's entire strategy. The jury members' faces hardened into solid stone. The heavy silence that followed the audio playback was absolute and suffocating. The defense attorney sat down heavily, his shoulders slumping in total defeat, realizing the Dark Alliance was entirely dead and his client's fate was permanently sealed. The presiding judge adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and formally concluded the evidentiary phase of the trial. He looked across the room and invited me to approach the central podium to deliver my victim impact statement before he handed down the final sentencing mandate. The entire gallery collectively held its breath. The reporters leaned forward aggressively, their eyes wide with anticipation. The defrauded corporate employees shifted to the very edge of their wooden benches. The room expected a fiery, righteous, vengeful speech. They anticipated a dramatic televised moment where the vindicated patriarch unleashed months of pent-up fury, verbally annihilating the woman who had attempted to destroy his mind and steal his legacy. I stood up from the plaintiff's bench and adjusted the cuffs of my charcoal suit. I did not rush. I walked across the polished hardwood floor with slow, deliberate, perfectly measured steps, the rhythmic strike of my leather shoes echoing sharply against the high ceiling. I reached the wooden stand and grasped the edges with both hands. I looked directly at the microphone positioned in front of me, but I did not lean into it. I did not speak a single word of anger, triumph, or sorrow into the silent room. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my jacket and extracted a single perfectly folded piece of paper. It was visibly old, the edges heavily faded and yellowed with time. I unfolded the document with meticulous care, smoothing the deep creases with the palm of my hand. I placed the single faded piece of paper flat onto the wooden stand, leaving the judge, the jury, and the breathless gallery suspended in absolute agonizing anticipation. "What does the paper say?" I kept my hand perfectly flat over the faded yellow paper for a long, heavy moment. The sprawling federal courtroom remained suspended in absolute, suffocating silence. Not a single camera shutter clicked from the media gallery. Not a single wooden chair creaked in the packed rows behind me. The presiding judge peered down from his elevated wooden bench, his brow furrowed in anticipation. The entire room expected me to present a newly discovered ledger, a hidden corporate contract, or a damning piece of physical evidence linking Vanessa directly to the kidnapped thugs. Instead, I carefully slid my hand away to reveal the document resting on the podium. It was not a list of Vanessa's financial felonies. It was not a catalog of the vicious verbal abuse I had endured, nor was it a summary of the violent assault on the concrete exit ramp. It was a standard, densely printed hospital billing statement. The ink had long since faded to a dull, washed-out gray over the years, but the bold, capitalized header of the oncology department remained entirely legible under the bright courtroom lights. It belonged to my late wife, Evelyn. The date stamped at the top right corner marked a day exactly 8 years ago. I adjusted the paper so the sensitive microphone would pick up the slight rustle of the dry parchment, ensuring every person in the gallery understood the physical, tangible reality of what I was holding. The defense attorneys strained their necks, completely confused by this sudden departure from the expected financial narrative. Vanessa stared at the paper with a blank, uncomprehending gaze, entirely unable to calculate how a decades-old medical bill could possibly threaten her legal defense. Jordan, however, recognized the specific pale shade of yellow paper immediately. His breath hitched audibly, a sharp, ragged sound that echoed in the quiet room. The remaining color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He knew exactly what this document represented. This was the final, devastating sum of his mother's last month on Earth. I tapped my index finger against the bottom line of the statement. There was a zero balance. The bill had been paid in full, but not by our premium medical insurance and not by my corporate forensic salary. It had been paid with the ultimate irreversible sacrifice. I looked directly at the jury box. 12 men and women stared back at me, waiting for the righteous anger they assumed would naturally follow. I did not give them anger. Anger is a fleeting, volatile emotion. I delivered the cold, inescapable truth. I leaned slightly toward the microphone. My voice was low, entirely devoid of tremor, sorrow, or hesitation. It carried through the heavy courtroom air with a sharp, unwavering clarity that demanded absolute attention. I told the jury about Evelyn. I did not speak of her as a tragic victim of a terminal disease, but as a woman of profound quiet and unyielding strength. I detailed the specific aggressive nature of the cancer that had invaded her body 8 years ago. The standard chemotherapy treatments had failed entirely, leaving us with one final viable option. An experimental, highly advanced immunotherapy protocol offered a genuine chance at full remission, or at the very least several more years of comfortable, pain-free life. It was breathtakingly expensive, but we had the funds completely secured in our private accounts. Then I shifted my gaze from the jury box directly to Jordan. He shrank back into his wooden chair, visibly trembling as I exposed the darkest, most closely guarded secret of his early adulthood. I detailed exactly how Jordan had accrued a massive, crushing mountain of illicit gambling debts during his final year of university. He had borrowed heavily from dangerous, unforgiving men, putting his own life in immediate lethal jeopardy. Evelyn discovered the truth just days before her experimental treatments were scheduled to officially begin. I explained to the silent, captive audience exactly what my wife chose to do. She explicitly refused the life-saving medical protocol. She deliberately redirected every single dollar of her specialized medical fund to entirely erase Jordan's underground debts. She bought his safety with her own time. She willingly traded the last remaining years of her life to ensure her son would not face the violent consequences of his reckless, selfish arrogance. I kept my eyes locked on Jordan as I spoke, watching him shatter. I exposed the ultimate, unforgivable cruelty of his existence. He was a son who had literally drained his mother's lifeblood to save himself from ruin. He had taken her future, her breath, and her final years. Yet years later, he eagerly returned to the home she built, allied with a predatory, manipulating woman to violently strip the dignity from the father who was left behind. He broke into the steel vault to steal the very heirloom jewelry Evelyn had cherished, pawning the precious memories of the woman who willingly died to save him. The sheer crushing gravity of the truth hit Jordan like a physical execution. He let out a ragged, suffocating gasp and buried his face entirely in his trembling hands. His shoulders he heaved violently as he broke down into loud, uncontrollable sobbing right at the defense table. He was utterly crushed by the inescapable weight of his own monstrous reality. There were no legal loopholes left to exploit, no manufactured victimhood to hide behind, and no more lies to spin. The gallery stared at him with absolute, unmasked disgust. Vanessa sat entirely paralyzed beside him. Her perfectly rehearsed courtroom demeanor, the fragile persona she had maintained for months, had completely evaporated. She stared blankly at the scuffed wooden floorboards, her mind short-circuiting as she realized her elaborate narrative of oppression had been utterly annihilated by a single faded piece of paper. She had attempted to paint me as an abusive tyrant, but the jury had just witnessed the profound, agonizing depth of my family's sacrifice and the sickening reality of her husband's greed. I did not wait for the presiding judge to offer his official condolences. I did not need validation or pity from the court. I folded the hospital billing statement with the exact same meticulous care I had used to unfold it. I tucked it safely back into the interior breast pocket of my charcoal suit, turned my back on the weeping coward at the defense table, and walked slowly back to the plaintiff's bench to take my seat. The judge sat in heavy, stunned silence for a long moment before quietly instructing the jury to begin their official deliberations. The 12 men and women stood up and filed out of the courtroom, their faces locked in cold, grim determination. The armed bailiffs stood guard at the heavy oak doors, preparing the gallery for what is usually a grueling multi-hour wait. I did not look at my watch. I simply folded my hands on the table and stared straight ahead. Exactly 14 minutes later, the heavy wooden doors swung open. A profound murmur rippled through the gallery. It was the fastest deliberation in the entire recorded history of the state's judicial district. The jury took their seats, and the forewoman stood up holding the printed verdict sheet. She did not hesitate. She read the charges aloud into the silent room. Grand larceny, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon. The word guilty echoed sharply through the room for every single count, perfectly unanimous, delivering absolute final ruin upon the two predators who had dared to challenge the truth. The presiding judge adjusted his heavy dark robes and looked down at the two shattered figures seated at the defense table. The room remained completely motionless, gripped by the gravity of the impending mandates. The judge spoke with a deep, resonant authority that left absolutely no room for interpretation or appeal. He addressed Vanessa first, looking directly into her vacant, exhausted eyes. He meticulously listed her transgressions, outlining the sheer predatory nature of her grand larceny and the extensive, calculated execution of her wire fraud. He emphasized the severe brutality of her physical attack on the concrete exit ramp, highlighting her absolute lack of remorse throughout the judicial process. For the aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, combined with the staggering financial felonies that devastated dozens of working-class families, the judge handed down a definitive, unyielding sentence. Vanessa was ordered to serve 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary with absolutely zero possibility of early parole. She simply slumped forward, the remaining fight entirely drained from her body. The judge then shifted his unwavering gaze to Jordan. My son sat trembling, his shoulders hunched in a posture of complete, pathetic defeat. The judge acknowledged Jordan's immediate cooperation and his signed plea agreement, noting that his testimony had expedited the trial. However, the judge severely condemned his inherent cowardice and his willing participation in the destruction of his own family. He methodically dismantled Jordan's fabricated victimhood, reminding the court that his initial intent was entirely driven by greed and a violent disregard for human life. For his role in the financial conspiracy and acting as a willing accessory to a multitude of severe federal crimes, the judge delivered a harsh, unavoidable reality. Jordan was sentenced to 5 years in a federal correctional facility. The judge made it explicitly clear that their assets would remain permanently seized to ensure full restitution for the defrauded pension holders. Every single luxury vehicle, every piece of designer property, and every hidden offshore account was instantly liquidated by federal mandate. The absolute finality of the federal justice system had completely crushed their arrogant delusions, leaving them with nothing but the cold concrete reality of the years ahead. The heavy wooden gavel struck the polished sound block with a sharp, explosive crack. The sound echoed violently through the silent room, a definitive punctuation mark on a saga of relentless betrayal. The armed bailiffs immediately stepped forward, their heavy-duty boots thudding against the hardwood floor. They grabbed Jordan and Vanessa by their arms, hauling them roughly to their feet. The sharp metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs filled the space as their wrists were secured tightly behind their backs. I did not flinch at the sound. I calmly stood up from the plaintiff's bench and meticulously buttoned the center button of my charcoal suit jacket. I did not look back at the two figures being escorted away. I kept my gaze fixed perfectly straight ahead. For 40 years, I had carried the immense, suffocating weight of parental responsibility. I had provided, protected, and forgiven every transgression under the misguided belief that unconditional love could eventually cure inherent selfishness. I had poured my energy, my wealth, and my late wife's final sacrifices into a man who ultimately viewed me as an expiring financial asset. That era was now permanently closed. Watching them being paraded toward the holding cells did not bring me a sudden rush of vindictive joy, nor did it summon any lingering traces of paternal grief. It brought me absolute, unadulterated clarity. My obligation as a parent had reached its definitive end. The toxic tether that bound me to Jordan's endless failures was completely severed by the sharp strike of the judge's gavel. I owed him absolutely nothing. I had survived their elaborate traps, outsmarted their hired enforcers, and dismantled their corporate empire using nothing but cold logic and unwavering patience. I turned away from the defense table and walked slowly down the center aisle of the courtroom. The defrauded maintenance workers and facility staff parted respectfully, offering silent nods of deep gratitude as I passed. I stepped out of the heavy double doors of the courtroom, leaving the stifling atmosphere of legal retribution behind me. I pushed through the heavy brass and glass revolving doors of the federal courthouse and stepped out onto the wide granite steps. The bright, blinding sunlight of the early afternoon washed over me, a stark and welcoming contrast to the gloomy, fluorescent purgatory of the justice system. I took a deep, steadying breath of the crisp city air, fully prepared to hail a private car and return to the quiet sanctuary of my estate. As I descended the first tier of the massive stone staircase, a figure abruptly detached itself from the shadow of a large marble pillar, deliberately blocking my path. It was a man wearing a remarkably cheap, ill-fitting beige suit. He held a scuffed leather briefcase tightly against his chest. His posture was rigid, and his eyes lacked the aggressive intensity of a street-level thug. He possessed the dull, persistent energy of a corporate bureaucrat. I stopped on the granite step, my muscles instantly tensing as I quickly scanned the surrounding perimeter for immediate physical threats. The man did not reach for a weapon. He smoothly unlatched his briefcase and extracted a thick, officially notarized legal folder. He introduced himself in a flat, monotone voice as a senior representative of a highly aggressive, perfectly legitimate corporate debt collection agency. He did not issue physical threats or demand back-alley meetings. He delivered a completely legal, terrifyingly structured financial nightmare. He explained that the violent underground loan sharks who held Jordan's massive gambling debts had grown tired of waiting. Realizing their primary target was now locked away in a federal penitentiary for the next 5 years, the criminal syndicate had executed a brilliant, devastating pivot. They had systematically laundered the illicit debt, officially selling the $500,000 deficit to a registered, licensed, and utterly relentless collection agency for pennies on the dollar. The man in the cheap suit tapped a manicured finger against the front page of the legal document. The agency was now officially and legally demanding that I pay the entire $500,000 balance immediately. They had exploited a complex web of familial liability clauses and co-signer technicalities buried deep within Jordan's fabricated financial history. The man stared at me with cold, bureaucratic certainty, clearly stating that as Jordan's next of kin and the sole remaining owner of a massive, unencumbered estate, I was legally obligated to absorb the crushing financial deficit. The underground criminals had failed to break me with brute force, but they had effectively weaponized the very legal system I had just used to secure my freedom. The man shoved the heavy legal folder directly against my chest, ensuring the war for my survival had merely evolved into a brand new, highly legalized battlefield. The man in the cheap beige suit stood firm on the granite steps of the federal courthouse, the heavy legal folder pressed aggressively against my chest. I did not flinch or break eye contact with him. I calmly reached up, took the thick manila envelope from his hands, and stepped around him without uttering a single word. I walked down the remaining stone steps, hailed a private car, and returned directly to the quiet security of my estate. That brief, silent encounter was merely the opening salvo of their legalized siege. By the end of the week, the collection agency launched a relentless, highly coordinated campaign designed entirely to break my psychological endurance. Official collection notices flooded my mailbox every single morning. They arrived in thick, red-stamped envelopes demanding immediate payment of $500,000. The letters escalated rapidly from formal requests to aggressive legal threats, explicitly citing my unalterable status as Jordan's next of kin. When the mail failed to intimidate me or provoke a response, the agency escalated to physical presence. Aggressive, imposing men dressed in cheap, identical dark suits began parking their unmarked sedans directly outside my iron front gates. They operated in rotating, disciplined shifts, ensuring that at least one vehicle was constantly idling at the edge of my property line. They did not knock on the door, ring the intercom, or attempt to breach the perimeter. They simply sat behind heavily tinted windows, watching my every move. Whenever I walked down the long driveway to retrieve the mail, they would slowly roll down their windows, letting me feel the heavy weight of their unbroken stares. They wanted me to feel hunted within my own sanctuary. They wanted my home to transform into a suffocating, isolated prison. They were relying on the typical reactions of elderly targets, assuming that a 70-year-old man living entirely alone would quickly succumb to the sheer, terrifying anxiety of constant surveillance. They calculated that I would eventually write a massive check simply to buy back my peace of mind. They drastically underestimated the absolute coldness of my resolve. I did not close the blinds. I did not draw the heavy velvet curtains. I went about my daily routine with precise, unbothered regularity. I tended to my garden in the bright afternoon sun, completely ignoring the idling sedans parked just yards away. After exactly 14 days of this silent psychological warfare, I decided it was time to end their theatrical intimidation. It was a crisp Tuesday morning. I brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee, poured 2 steaming portions into my best porcelain mugs, and placed them carefully onto a polished silver serving tray. I walked straight out the front door, leaving it wide open behind me, and marched directly down the cobblestone driveway toward the idling black sedan. I stopped right at the driver's side window. The man inside the exact same lead collector from the courthouse steps lowered the glass with a smug, victorious smirk, clearly believing I had finally cracked under the pressure. I did not raise my voice or display an ounce of anger. I calmly invited him inside my home for a cup of coffee and a final resolution to his persistent claim. The collector grabbed his heavy leather briefcase, stepped out of the vehicle, and followed me into my living room with the arrogant stride of a man who believed he had already secured his commission. He sat down heavily on the antique sofa, placing his briefcase aggressively onto the mahogany coffee table. I sat in the armchair opposite him and pushed one of the porcelain mugs toward him. He ignored the coffee entirely, immediately launching into a rehearsed aggressive monologue about asset seizure, property liens, and the inescapable legal obligation of familial debt. He tapped his finger sharply against the glass table, demanding my bank routing numbers to process the initial payment. I let him finish his entire speech without interruption. When the room finally fell silent, I opened the single drawer of the side table next to my chair. I did not pull out a checkbook. I extracted a crisp, officially notarized legal document enclosed in a blue protective folder. I slid the paperwork smoothly across the mahogany table. It was a formal, legally binding severance of kinship. I explained to the man in a low, unwavering voice that I had anticipated severe financial fallout the very moment I initiated my forensic audit of Vanessa's accounts. I detailed how exactly 3 months ago, on the very morning after my son had thrown me out into the freezing rain to protect his fraudulent lifestyle, I had met with a specialized family law attorney. I had systematically and permanently removed Jordan from my estate, my will, and my legal lineage. I explicitly instructed the lead collector to read the final page of the document. He picked up the heavy parchment, his smug expression faltering as his eyes scanned the dense legal terminology. He traced his finger down to the bottom of the page, stopping abruptly at the raised embossed seal of the state Supreme Court. The document officially decreed that Jordan was no longer legally recognized as my son or my dependent in any capacity, thereby completely nullifying any claim of next of kin liability. The underground loan sharks had sold a worthless, uncollectible debt to a legitimate agency. The realization hit the collector with the force of a physical blow. He realized instantly that his agency had wasted hundreds of thousands of dollars purchasing a financial black hole. He had absolutely zero legal grounds to collect a single penny from my accounts. The man's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. He slammed the notarized document back onto the mahogany table and stood up so violently that his knees knocked against the edge of the furniture. He gripped the handle of his leather briefcase, his knuckles turning white with sheer frustration. He glared down at me, breathing heavily, completely abandoning his polished corporate facade. Before turning toward the open front door, he leaned forward and delivered a vicious, calculated threat. He sneered that legal immunity did not protect me from public destruction. He warned me that his agency maintained deep, lucrative connections with tabloid journalists and aggressive local media outlets. He swore that if I did not willingly write a check to cover the massive deficit, he would leak a highly distorted, fabricated story to the press. He promised to paint me as a ruthless, hoarding millionaire who gladly watched his own son rot in a federal penitentiary while hiding behind legal loopholes to avoid paying his family's debts. He threatened to drag my name through the mud, guaranteeing that my peaceful retirement would be utterly destroyed by a relentless, vicious media smear campaign. He turned on his heel and marched out of the house, leaving the heavy threat hanging in the quiet morning air. The physical perimeter of my home was secure and my financial assets were perfectly shielded by the law, but my public reputation was now squarely in the crosshairs of a ruthless corporate machine. The cheap-suited collector did not issue an empty threat. Less than 48 hours after our confrontation in my living room, a highly coordinated, vicious smear campaign detonated across the local and regional digital landscape. An anonymously authored, heavily sponsored article appeared on the front page of a prominent city news blog specifically engineered to generate maximum public outrage. The narrative painted a fabricated, grotesque caricature of my life. It depicted me as a heartless, hoarding millionaire patriarch who sat safely in his fortified mansion while willingly letting his only son rot in a federal penitentiary. The article completely omitted Vanessa's psychotic assault, Jordan's crippling gambling addiction, and the undeniable fact that they had conspired to lock me in a psychiatric ward to steal my estate. Instead, the focus remained entirely on the $500,000 debt, framing it as a tragic family financial crisis that I aggressively refused to settle out of sheer unadulterated greed. The agency had clearly leveraged their extensive media contacts, utilizing clickbait journalism to manipulate the narrative and assassinate my character. The digital fallout was instantaneous and explosive. The article was shared thousands of times across social media platforms within a matter of hours, attracting a swarm of vicious comments from strangers who eagerly consumed the manufactured tragedy. By the following morning, the digital harassment transformed into a physical invasion. The quiet sanctuary of my street was completely overrun. A fleet of glaring white news vans, satellite broadcasting trucks, and freelance paparazzi vehicles clogged the narrow suburban road. Reporters trampled over my meticulously kept front lawn, dragging heavy power cables and setting up camera tripods directly outside my wrought iron gates. They shouted aggressive, leading questions through the metal bars, demanding I justify my supposed cruelty. The collection agency had unleashed a localized media circus to break my resolve, banking on the assumption that a man of my age and standing would ultimately pay any price to avoid public humiliation. They wanted me to retreat inside my home, draw the curtains, and surrender to the crushing weight of public shame. They fundamentally misunderstood the man they were attempting to extort. I did not hide in the shadows of my living room. I prepared to end their extortion permanently. I adjusted the cuffs of my charcoal suit, unlocked the heavy oak front door, and walked deliberately down the stone path toward the iron gates. The chaotic clamor of the press corps instantly amplified. Microphones were thrust aggressively through the metal bars, and a barrage of camera flashes momentarily blinded the morning air. I did not raise my voice to compete with their shouting. I simply unlocked the electronic gate and stepped directly into the center of the media swarm. The sudden, absolute lack of resistance caught the reporters entirely off guard, forcing the frantic crowd into a stunned, immediate silence. I looked directly into the primary broadcast camera and delivered a prepared, irrefutable statement. I did not offer a defense against the tabloid article, nor did I attempt to argue the minutiae of my son's federal conviction. I completely bypassed their fabricated narrative and announced the immediate, irrevocable transfer of my entire $2 million liquid fortune. I explained that as of 8 o'clock that morning, the funds had been permanently wired out of my private accounts and deposited directly into a newly established, highly restricted charitable trust. I named it the Evelyn Foundation, honoring the absolute sacrifice of my late wife. I detailed the strict, unalterable mandate of the charity. The $2 million would be exclusively utilized to provide aggressive, top-tier legal representation for elderly individuals facing financial exploitation, family abuse, and predatory collection agencies. I looked directly at the reporter who had authored the smear piece and stated with absolute clarity that I had retained absolutely nothing from my corporate investments. I had willingly reduced my personal wealth to the deed of my modest suburban home and a basic, fixed monthly pension. I stripped away the exact target the debt collectors were desperately trying to hit. I explained that the collection agency had wasted thousands of dollars organizing a media circus to extort a fortune that simply no longer existed. The millions they sought to seize were now legally locked behind an impenetrable iron shield of charitable bylaws, entirely untouchable by any court order, lien, or familial debt claim. I had completely liquidated the leverage they held over my life. The live broadcast of my press conference hit the collection agency headquarters with the devastating force of a seismic shockwave. The lead collector sitting in his downtown office realized instantly that he had been completely outmaneuvered. He had authorized a massive expenditure on aggressive surveillance and digital smear campaigns, operating on the absolute certainty that he could eventually drain my corporate accounts. Now he faced the catastrophic reality of a $500,000 uncollectible deficit and zero legal avenues to recover a single dime. The deep pockets he had relied upon to save his agency's profit margin had evaporated into thin air. Furthermore, the very media apparatus he had weaponized against me immediately spun out of his control. The local news stations quickly investigated the Evelyn Foundation, verifying the massive transfer of wealth and the noble protective mandate of the charity. The public opinion that had been so artificially manipulated against me violently reversed direction. The citizens of the city did not see a heartless hoarding patriarch. They saw an uncompromising, principled man who willingly surrendered his entire life savings to protect vulnerable citizens from the exact type of predators who had destroyed his own family. I was hailed as a localized hero, a man who transformed a profound personal tragedy into a permanent shield for the defenseless. The backlash against the collection agency was swift and merciless. Investigative journalists rapidly pivoted their attention, digging deeply into the agency's shady acquisition of underground gambling debts and their predatory intimidation tactics. Facing imminent federal scrutiny and an absolute public relations disaster, the collection agency immediately severed all contact. The unmarked sedans that had idled menacingly outside my property vanished overnight. The aggressive phone calls ceased entirely. The threatening legal notices stopped arriving in my mailbox. The aggressive men in cheap suits retreated back into the corporate shadows, completely abandoning their pursuit of Jordan's toxic debt. The final lingering threat to my peace had been permanently neutralized. I walked back into my quiet, empty house and locked the door behind me. I was no longer a wealthy corporate director, nor was I the victim of a greedy, manipulative family. I was simply a man who had successfully defended his sanctuary, utterly destroying the forces of greed that had dared to cross his threshold. The morning air hanging over the suburban street was completely silent. The oppressive hum of idling engines and the frantic shouting of desperate reporters had permanently vanished, replaced only by the gentle rustle of wind through the heavy oak branches. The media circus had packed up and left the moment the collection agency realized my wealth was legally untouchable. I stood on the front porch and breathed in the crisp, unburdened air. To ensure this peace remained absolutely unbroken, I hired an independent professional locksmith to overhaul the entire physical security perimeter of the estate. I watched with quiet satisfaction as the technician systematically drilled out the heavy brass deadbolts on the front door, the back patio entrance, and the reinforced garage access. He replaced every single cylinder with advanced high-security lock mechanisms, handing me a completely new, untethered set of heavy steel keys. The physical breach that Jordan and Vanessa had exploited was now permanently sealed. Once the locksmith departed, leaving the house in total isolation, I began the meticulous process of dismantling the internal surveillance network I had built to trap them. I retrieved a small stepladder from the utility closet and carried it into the guest bedroom, the exact site of Vanessa's ultimate downfall. I climbed the steps and reached carefully behind the decorative crown molding above the headboard. My fingers brushed against the small black plastic casing of the microscopic voice-activated recorder. I detached the device from its adhesive mount and climbed down. I moved methodically through the hallway, the dining room, and the primary living spaces, unscrewing the tiny concealed lenses hidden inside the smoke detectors and behind the antique bookshelf. These devices had served their absolute purpose, capturing the unvarnished greed and homicidal intent of my own flesh and blood. They were no longer necessary. I gathered the handful of electronic recording devices, power cords, and encrypted memory cards, carried them directly to the heavy metal trash bin in the garage, and dropped them inside. The metallic clatter echoed sharply against the cement floor, signaling the definitive end of the surveillance state. My home was no longer a meticulously rigged battlefield designed to capture federal evidence. It had reverted entirely to a place of shelter. The crushing anxiety of anticipating the next betrayal was gone, leaving only the quiet, secure rhythm of a life finally lived on my own terms. I walked slowly down the central hallway and stopped directly in front of the heavy mahogany doors of the primary study. This was the exact room where the entire brutal war had commenced, the ground zero of Vanessa's insatiable greed. I turned the brass knob and pushed the doors open, stepping over the threshold into the quiet space. The room was absolutely immaculate. The thick, chaotic layer of drywall dust, shattered plaster, and torn insulation that had once coated the Persian rug was entirely gone. I had hired a specialized contracting crew weeks ago to completely reconstruct the heavy architectural damage Vanessa had inflicted during her frantic late-night angle grinder assault. The faux wood paneling had been seamlessly replaced, the paint perfectly color-matched to the original rich, dark mahogany tone. The massive reinforced steel wall safes that once held the antique heirloom jewelry and my sensitive corporate ledgers had been entirely removed from the property. The massive cavities they left behind were filled with solid cinder block and sealed shut with heavy plaster. There was absolutely nothing left to steal. The architectural scars of their treason had been thoroughly erased, leaving no physical evidence that the violent breach had ever occurred. I ran my hand slowly across the smooth, newly polished surface of the repaired wall. For decades, I had utilized this specific room as a heavily fortified vault, a place to bury my wealth and protect my assets from the prying eyes of opportunistic rivals. I had inadvertently created a dark, secretive environment that ultimately fueled Jordan's toxic entitlement and Vanessa's manic paranoia. By legally transferring my entire $2 million fortune to the Evelyn Foundation, I had permanently eliminated the need for hidden compartments and heavy steel combination locks. The sheer suffocating burden of protecting a massive corporate fortune was gone. There were no more financial secrets buried behind the plaster, no more elaborate digital traps waiting to be sprung, and absolutely no more ungrateful hands desperately reaching for things they did not earn. The study was no longer a fortress of deception. It was simply a room lined with classic literature and bathed in natural light. The predatory entitlement that had poisoned my family tree was entirely starved of oxygen, cut off from the massive wealth that had sustained its dark growth for so many years. I left the study and walked into the spotless kitchen to begin the quiet, familiar ritual of the morning. I filled the glass carafe with fresh cold water and measured out a dark, robust blend of ground coffee beans. The machine hummed to life, filling the open space with a rich, comforting aroma that grounded me in the present moment. I poured the steaming black liquid into a heavy ceramic mug, feeling the soothing heat radiate against my palms. I carried the coffee back into the primary living room and walked directly toward the massive bay window overlooking the expansive front lawn. I sat down heavily into my favorite worn leather armchair, the thick material creaking softly under my weight. The early morning sun crested the tops of the tall suburban oak trees, flooding the entire living room with a brilliant, warm, golden light. The bright rays illuminated the floating dust motes and cast long, peaceful shadows across the hardwood floor. I took a slow, deliberate sip of this dark coffee, savoring the absolute stillness of the house. No telephones were ringing with frantic threats from underground debt collectors. No desperate, manipulating relatives were plotting my physical and psychological demise from the guest bedroom. The heavy, dark storm of corporate greed, emotional blackmail, and physical violence had completely broken against the iron wall of my resolve. This profound, settling tranquility was not a gift blindly handed to me by fate. It was a victory aggressively fought for and secured through absolute discipline. I had protected my life and my late wife's legacy through meticulous patience, cold intellect, and the ruthless, unyielding willingness to completely cut out the toxic rot that had infected my family. I did not mourn the son who chose a federal prison cell over honest labor, nor did I lament the loss of the fortune I gladly surrendered to protect other vulnerable victims. I had traded my wealth for something entirely priceless. The dark parasitic forces that sought to consume me were completely eradicated, leaving a pure and untouchable serenity in their wake. My mind, once burdened by the constant chess match of survival, was now clear and unburdened. The air in the room felt light, clean, and completely breathable. Order was finally and permanently restored. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.